Welcome, friends. Many of you enjoy these true trucker horror stories, but most who watch still aren't subscribed. If you'd like to support the channel and hear more dark tales from the road, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Your support helps these stories reach more people. Now buckle up. Let's begin tonight's chilling stories. Frank Miller had been running the same route for 18 years when everything changed on that October night in 2019. The 52-year-old veteran trucker from Council Bluffs, Iowa, knew every mile of Interstate 80 between Des Moines and Omaha like the back of his weathered hands. In nearly 2 decades of hauling agricultural equipment across the Midwest, Frank had encountered his share of unusual situations: drunk drivers, severe weather, mechanical failures, and the occasional road rage incident. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what would unfold during what should have been a routine overnight haul. The evening of October 23rd began unremarkably. Frank completed his pre-trip inspection of his burgundy Peterbilt 379 at the Heartland Distribution Center outside Des Moines at 6:17 p.m. His manifest showed a standard load of irrigation equipment bound for a farming cooperative near Omaha, with delivery scheduled for 7 o'clock a.m. the following morning. The weight distribution was perfect, his logbook up to date, and the weather forecast called for clear skies with light winds. Everything suggested an easy run that would have him back home by noon the next day. Frank had always preferred night driving, especially during harvest season when I-80 became congested with agricultural traffic during daylight hours. The darkness brought a peaceful solitude that he'd grown to cherish over the years. His Peterbilt, purchased used in 2015, had become like a second home to him. The cab was meticulously organized, with family photos taped to the dashboard, a small cooler stocked with Dorothy's homemade sandwiches, and his father's old compass mounted near the CB radio. Tonight felt no different as he pulled onto the interstate at 6:43 p.m., settling into the familiar rhythm of highway driving. The first hour passed without incident. Frank maintained a steady 65 miles per hour, occasionally adjusting his speed to accommodate other traffic or changing road conditions. His CB radio crackled occasionally with the voices of other drivers sharing road conditions and the casual conversation that connected the fraternity of long-haul truckers across the empty miles. Channel 19 carried the usual chatter: warnings about speed traps, updates on construction zones, and the good-natured banter that helped pass the lonely hours. At 7:45 p.m., Frank passed through Grinnell, a small college town whose lights twinkled in the distance north of the highway. He'd stopped at the truck stop there countless times over the years, knew the cashiers by name, and often grabbed coffee and a slice of their famous apple pie. Tonight, with good time and clear roads ahead, he decided to push through to his destination without unnecessary stops. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, and his electronic logging device indicated he had plenty of driving time remaining before mandatory rest was required. The moon rose full and bright as Frank continued eastward, casting the Iowa farmland in silver light that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Cornfields, mostly harvested now, created geometric patterns of stubble and shadow on both sides of the highway. Occasionally, he passed farmhouses with warm yellow windows, each one representing a family settling in for the evening. Frank had grown up on a farm himself, about 60 miles south of his current route, and the sight of these rural homesteads always brought back memories of his childhood. At 8:15 p.m., Frank made his first scheduled check-in with dispatch, using the satellite communication system mounted on his dashboard. Heartland Dispatch, this is Unit 47, checking in from mile marker 126 eastbound. All systems green, ETA unchanged at 0700 hours. The response came back promptly from Beth, the night dispatcher who had been with the company almost as long as Frank himself. "Copy that, Frank. Weather looks good all the way through. Drive safe out there." Traffic remained light, consisting mainly of other commercial vehicles and the occasional passenger car. Frank recognized several trucks from regular drivers who worked similar routes, exchanging the customary flash of headlights as they passed. There was Walter Jenkins in his distinctive green Kenworth, heading westbound with what looked like a load of construction materials. Rita Morrison in her immaculate white Freightliner, probably hauling livestock feed to one of the big operations near Des Moines. These were the people who formed Frank's extended highway family, connected by CB radio and the shared understanding of life on the road. The first unusual occurrence happened at 8:47 p.m., though Frank didn't recognize its significance at the time. While adjusting his side mirror to check for traffic, he noticed what appeared to be a faint light source reflected in the convex glass. The light seemed to be coming from somewhere behind and above his trailer, but when he checked his other mirrors and glanced out the rear window of his sleeper compartment, he saw nothing unusual. The eastbound lanes were empty except for his truck, and the westbound traffic was too distant to create such a reflection. Frank attributed the anomaly to perhaps a low-flying aircraft or the reflection of his own running lights off some atmospheric condition. October nights in Iowa could create unusual optical effects, especially with the combination of harvest dust in the air and the bright moonlight. He made a mental note to clean his mirrors at his next stop, but thought nothing more of the incident. By 9:15 p.m., Frank had passed through Newton, another familiar waypoint on his regular route. The small city's truck stop was one of his frequent overnight stops when his schedule required a longer break, but tonight he was making good time and planned to continue straight through. The highway stretched ahead in a long straight line that seemed to disappear into the darkness beyond his headlight range. This section of I-80 was famous among drivers for its monotony, mile after mile of gently rolling farmland with only occasional towns to break the hypnotic rhythm of the road. It was just after 9:30 p.m. when Frank first noticed the headlights in his mirrors. The approaching vehicle wasn't unusual in itself. Cars and trucks regularly passed his rig on this stretch of highway. What caught his attention was the way the headlights seemed unusually bright, with an almost bluish tint that stood out against the typical yellow-white glow of standard vehicle lighting. The lights maintained a steady distance behind him for several miles, neither approaching to pass nor falling back, just holding position in the darkness. Frank adjusted his mirrors for a better view, but couldn't make out the vehicle's make or model. The brightness of the headlights created a harsh glare that obscured any details beyond their piercing intensity. After nearly 15 minutes of this constant following, Frank began to feel uneasy. In his years of driving, vehicles that tailed trucks for extended periods usually belonged to law enforcement conducting inspections, but those encounters typically involved flashing lights and radio contact. This vehicle showed no official markings or signals that Frank could detect. The pursuing vehicle's behavior became increasingly unsettling as the minutes passed. Most civilian drivers following a truck would either pass when an opportunity presented itself or gradually fall back to a more comfortable following distance. Commercial drivers understood the aerodynamic benefits of following large vehicles closely but usually maintained enough distance to ensure safe stopping. This vehicle seemed to be maintaining a precise distance of approximately 200 feet, as if it were somehow locked onto Frank's trailer. Deciding to test his followers' intentions, Frank gradually reduced his speed from 68 to 62 miles per hour. Most civilian vehicles would either pass or increase their following distance when a truck slowed on the interstate. The mystery vehicle did neither. It maintained the exact same distance, as if connected by an invisible tether. When Frank returned to his original speed, the follower matched his acceleration perfectly, never wavering from its position behind his trailer. Frank's uneasiness grew when he realized that the pursuing vehicle was anticipating his speed changes. As an experienced driver, Frank was aware of the subtle cues that preceded his own driving decisions. The slight pressure on the accelerator before accelerating, the momentary easing off the throttle before slowing. Yet this vehicle seemed to be responding to his intentions before he had fully acted on them, maintaining that precise following distance with uncanny accuracy. By 10:00 p.m., Frank's unease had grown into genuine concern. He reached for his CB radio and switched to Channel 19, the standard frequency for driver communication. Breaker 19, this is Iowa Frank eastbound on I-80 at mile marker 98. Anyone else seeing unusual lighting or vehicles out here tonight? The response came from a driver about 10 miles ahead. Negative, Iowa Frank. Clear sailing up here. What kind of unusual lighting you talking about? Frank described the persistent follower with the abnormally bright headlights, but no other drivers reported similar encounters. Rita Morrison, the driver he had passed earlier, came back on the radio from somewhere behind him. Frank, I've been westbound for about 30 minutes now. Passed you around mile 85. Didn't see any unusual traffic in your area. You feeling all right out there? The concern in Rita's voice was genuine. The trucking community looked out for each other, and unusual behavior or reports could indicate driver fatigue, medical issues, or other serious problems. Frank appreciated her attention, but insisted that something was definitely following him. I'm wide awake and feeling fine, Rita. This vehicle has been on my tail for over 30 minutes now, maintaining perfect distance regardless of my speed changes. Never seen anything like it. Another voice joined the conversation, belonging to Harold Watts, a veteran driver Frank had known for over a decade. Frank, you want me to circle back and take a look? I'm about 15 miles ahead of you, but I can find a turnaround. Frank considered the offer but decided against it. If this was some form of road rage or criminal activity, involving another driver might escalate the situation. Instead, he decided to force a confrontation by leaving the interstate. At 10:23 p.m., Frank activated his turn signal and began moving toward the next exit, the small interchange serving the rural community of Grinnell. If this was some form of road rage or criminal activity, he reasoned that pulling off the interstate might either deter his follower or provide an opportunity to call for help in a populated area. The mystery vehicle followed him down the exit ramp, its brilliant headlights illuminating the deserted off-ramp like daylight. The Grinnell exit led to a truck stop that Frank had used many times over the years. The Flying J facility included multiple fuel islands, a restaurant, shower facilities, and a parking area large enough for several dozen tractor-trailers. At this hour, the lot contained about 8 other trucks, their drivers either sleeping in their cabs or inside the restaurant. Frank pulled into a space under one of the parking lot's tall sodium vapor lights, hoping the illumination would finally allow him to see his pursuer clearly. As Frank's truck came to a stop, the mystery vehicle pulled into the lot but remained at the far edge, just beyond the reach of the overhead lighting. Its headlights suddenly dimmed to normal intensity, but Frank still couldn't distinguish the vehicle's make, model, or color. It appeared to be a mid-sized sedan or SUV, but the distance and shadows made positive identification impossible. For several minutes, both vehicles remained motionless, as if engaged in some bizarre standoff. Frank's cell phone showed 2 bars of signal strength enough to make a call. He contacted the Poweshiek County Sheriff's Office, explaining his situation to the dispatcher. The woman on the other end took his information seriously, asking detailed questions about the pursuing vehicle and his current location. She promised to send a deputy to investigate, but warned that response time might be 30 to 40 minutes due to the rural location and the fact that their nearest unit was handling another call. While waiting for law enforcement, Frank decided to observe his pursuer more carefully. He stepped into the sleeper compartment of his cab, which provided a better viewing angle toward the mysterious vehicle. Through the tinted windows of his truck, he could make out the general shape of what appeared to be a dark sedan, possibly a Crown Victoria or similar full-size car. The vehicle sat motionless in the shadows, its engine apparently running based on the visible exhaust vapor in the cool night air. What Frank observed next would haunt him for months to come. As he watched through his rear window, the sedan began to move slowly forward, not toward the exit or toward the truck stop building, but directly toward Frank's truck. The movement was deliberate and unhurried, as if the driver had finally decided to reveal their intentions. Frank remained in his sleeper compartment, uncertain whether to lock himself in or prepare to defend himself. The sedan stopped approximately 50 feet from Frank's driver's side door, positioning itself so that its headlights illuminated the entire side of the truck. Frank could now see the vehicle clearly for the first time all evening, and what he observed made no rational sense. The car appeared to be a black sedan, possibly from the early 2000s, but there was something fundamentally wrong with its appearance. The vehicle seemed somehow compressed or flattened, as if he were viewing it through a distorting lens. The windows were tinted so darkly they appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even with the truck stop's overhead lighting and the sedan's own headlights providing illumination, Frank couldn't see any hint of the interior or the driver. The headlights themselves, despite their brilliant output, seemed to be mounted in recessed housings that gave them an almost sunken appearance, as if they were deeper in the front of the car than should have been physically possible. Frank's military training from his younger days kicked in as he assessed the situation. He had served 4 years in the Army as a transportation specialist before beginning his civilian trucking career, and though he had never seen combat, he had received training in threat assessment and personal security. Everything about this encounter violated his understanding of normal human behavior. The precise following, the anticipatory responses to his speed changes, and now this deliberate positioning all suggested either sophisticated surveillance technology or something outside his experience entirely. At 10:47 p.m., exactly 25 minutes after Frank had called for help, he spotted the flashing lights of a sheriff's patrol car approaching on the access road from town. The timing of what happened next would haunt him for months afterward. Just as the patrol car's headlights swept across the truck stop entrance, the mystery vehicle's engine note changed, and it began moving again. Instead of fleeing, however, it slowly drove directly toward Frank's truck, its headlights once again blazing with that unnatural intensity. Deputy Margaret Chen, a 12-year veteran of the Poweshiek County Sheriff's Office, later documented Frank's statement in extraordinary detail. Her incident report, which would eventually be forwarded to state and federal investigators, noted Frank's description of the vehicle's impossibly dark windows and what he termed its compressed appearance. When the patrol car pulled into the lot with its emergency lights fully activated, the sedan was positioned directly beside Frank's truck. Deputy Chen's training included protocols for handling suspicious vehicles and potential criminal activity. She approached with her patrol car positioned to block the sedan's most likely escape route, activated her vehicle's spotlight, and used the PA system to order the driver to step out with hands visible. What happened next challenged every aspect of her law enforcement experience. The sedan's driver door opened, but no dome light illuminated the interior. Deputy Chen could see the door swing wide, but the inside of the vehicle remained completely dark, as if the opening led into a void rather than a car interior. After several seconds, a figure emerged from the vehicle, but even with multiple light sources, her spotlight, the overhead parking lot lights, and Frank's truck's exterior lighting, she couldn't make out any details about the individual. Frank watched from his cab as the figure stood beside the sedan. Despite adequate lighting from multiple sources, the person appeared to be surrounded by shadows that moved independently of any light source. The figure was approximately average height and appeared to be wearing dark clothing. But beyond these basic observations, no features were distinguishable. Most unsettling was the way the person moved, with a smooth, gliding gait that seemed to ignore the normal mechanics of walking. Deputy Chen approached with her weapon drawn, repeatedly ordering the individual to step away from the vehicle and show identification. According to her report, the figure finally turned toward her, but she was unable to see any distinguishing features despite being less than 20 feet away with her flashlight directed at what should have been the person's face. It was like trying to look at someone through heavy fog, she would later tell investigators, even though the air was perfectly clear and I could see everything else normally. The figure appeared to acknowledge Deputy Chen's presence, but showed no sign of understanding or compliance with her commands. Instead, it turned toward Frank's truck and seemed to be studying the vehicle with what Chen described as unnatural focus. The deputy continued issuing commands, but the figure showed no reaction to her voice, her flashlight, or even her physical presence when she moved closer. What happened next was captured partially on the patrol car's dashboard camera, though the footage would later be described as inconclusive by state investigators. The dark figure appeared to gesture toward Frank's truck, extending what might have been an arm in a sweeping motion that encompassed the entire vehicle. Then, just as deliberately as it had emerged, the figure began walking back toward the sedan with that same unsettling gliding motion. Deputy Chen followed, continuing to issue commands and warnings, but the figure showed no acknowledgement of her presence. When it reached the sedan, it paused beside the driver's door for several seconds, as if waiting for something. Chen later reported that during this pause, she experienced a profound sense of disorientation, as if the parking lot around her had suddenly become unfamiliar, despite her having visited the truck stop countless times over the years. The figure then appeared to dissolve into the vehicle rather than enter it conventionally. Deputy Chen's report carefully avoided dramatic language, but she noted that she did not observe the normal process of a person getting into a car. One moment the figure was standing beside the open door, and the next moment the door was closing, and the sedan's engine was starting. The sedan began moving toward the parking lot exit with the same deliberate pace it had maintained throughout the encounter. Deputy Chen attempted to conduct a traffic stop, returning to her patrol car and pursuing the vehicle with emergency lights and siren activated. However, once the sedan reached the access road leading back to the interstate, its performance became unlike anything in her 12 years of law enforcement experience. Despite her patrol car's powerful V8 engine and her extensive pursuit driving training, Deputy Chen was unable to close the distance as the sedan accelerated toward the interstate on-ramp. The vehicle didn't appear to be speeding in any dramatic fashion, but it consistently maintained a lead that widened despite her best efforts to catch up. By the time she reached the interstate, the sedan's taillights had disappeared into the darkness, leaving no trace except for the bewildered testimonies of Frank Miller and herself. The official investigation that followed would consume weeks and involve multiple law enforcement agencies. The Iowa State Patrol assigned Detective Lieutenant James Morrison to coordinate the case, and he approached it with the methodical thoroughness that had characterized his 23-year career. Morrison's first step was to interview Frank and Deputy Chen separately, looking for inconsistencies or details that might explain the encounter through conventional means. Frank's account remained consistent through multiple interviews. He provided detailed descriptions of the pursuing vehicle's behavior, its unusual lighting characteristics, and his own actions throughout the encounter. Most importantly, he offered full access to his truck's electronic systems, including the electronic logging device that recorded all operational parameters during his drive. Analysis of Frank's electronic logging device data revealed the first major anomaly in the case. The device, which continuously monitors and records truck speed, location, engine parameters, and driving patterns, showed readings during the pursuit that didn't match Frank's account or Deputy Chen's observations. According to the electronic record, Frank's truck had deviated from I-80 3 times during the evening, making stops at locations that were dozens of miles from his reported route. The GPS data showed visits to rural locations that Frank had no memory of reaching. One recorded stop lasted 47 minutes at coordinates that placed his truck in a cornfield approximately 30 miles south of the interstate. Another showed a 2-hour period where his truck was apparently stationary at an abandoned grain elevator near a town Frank was certain he had never visited. Most puzzling was a recorded interaction with a way station that had been closed for over 5 years. Technical experts from the ELD manufacturer were brought in to examine the device and its data. Their analysis confirmed that the electronic components were functioning properly and showed no signs of tampering or malfunction. The anomalous readings appeared to be genuine records of the truck's activities, but they described a journey that neither Frank nor any corroborating evidence could support. Dr. Emily Reeves, a neurologist at the University of Iowa Medical Center, was consulted regarding the possibility that Frank had experienced some form of altered consciousness during his drive. Highway hypnosis, a well-documented phenomenon where drivers can complete long journeys with little conscious memory of the experience, seemed like a potential explanation. However, this condition typically results in gaps in memory rather than false memories, and it couldn't account for Deputy Chen's corroborating testimony. Dr. Reeves conducted a comprehensive neurological examination of Frank, including brain imaging and cognitive function tests. The results showed no abnormalities or conditions that would predispose him to hallucinations, memory problems, or altered states of consciousness. Frank's mental health evaluation was equally normal, revealing no signs of psychiatric conditions that might explain his experience. The investigation expanded to include analysis of traffic camera footage from every available source along Frank's route. The Iowa Department of Transportation provided recordings from dozens of cameras positioned at interchanges, way stations, and construction zones. State police contributed footage from patrol car cameras and fixed enforcement positions. Even private businesses along the corridor were contacted for any security camera recordings that might have captured Frank's truck or the pursuing sedan. The results of this comprehensive video analysis were deeply troubling. Multiple cameras had recorded Frank's truck traveling eastbound on I-80 during the time period in question, confirming his presence on the interstate and his general timeline. However, no camera had captured any image of the pursuing sedan that Frank described. Even more puzzling, several cameras showed Frank's truck alone on stretches of highway where he clearly remembered being followed. One particularly significant piece of footage came from a traffic camera at mile marker 92, positioned to monitor a construction zone. The camera had a clear view of both eastbound lanes and showed Frank's truck passing at 9:47 p.m., precisely when he reported being actively pursued. The video clearly showed his truck traveling alone, with no other vehicles visible in either direction for several minutes before and after his passage. Detective Morrison expanded the investigation to include interviews with other drivers who had been on I-80 that evening. Using CB radio logs and commercial dispatch records, investigators identified and contacted dozens of truckers who had been traveling the same corridor. While several drivers remembered speaking with Frank on the radio and confirmed his reports of being followed, none had personally observed the pursuing sedan. Rita Morrison, the driver who had expressed concern for Frank over the CB radio, provided particularly detailed testimony. She confirmed that Frank had seemed genuinely distressed during their radio conversation and that his description of being followed was consistent and coherent. However, when she had passed his location while traveling westbound, she had observed his truck alone on the highway with no following vehicles visible. The case took an even more mysterious turn when investigators discovered that Frank's CB radio communications from that night included conversations that no other drivers remembered participating in. Analysis of radio traffic logs from the Federal Communications Commission revealed that Frank's truck had transmitted and received communications on several frequencies that were not in use by any licensed operators during the time period in question. These phantom radio conversations, recovered from Frank's truck's communication system memory, included detailed discussions about highway conditions, weather reports, and even personal conversations with drivers who either didn't exist or had no memory of talking with Frank. Most unsettling were several transmissions that appeared to be warnings about following protocols and maintaining position, conversations that Frank had no conscious memory of having. Dr. Sarah Kellerman, a researcher specializing in highway safety psychology at Iowa State University, became involved in the case through her ongoing study of driver stress and perception. Her initial interest was in the psychological factors that might cause an experienced driver to perceive threats that weren't present, but as she delved deeper into Frank's case, she began to suspect that something more complex was occurring. Dr. Kellerman's analysis identified what she termed predictive following behavior in Frank's account, the pursuing vehicle's apparent ability to anticipate his driving decisions before he consciously made them. This aspect of the encounter violated normal human reaction times and suggested either superhuman driving skills or some form of advanced knowledge of Frank's intentions. In a typical following situation, Dr. Kellerman explained in her preliminary report, there's always a measurable delay between the lead vehicle's action and the follower's response. Even the most skilled drivers require time to perceive, process, and react to changes in the vehicle ahead of them. Frank's description suggests simultaneous or even anticipatory responses that would be impossible for a human driver to achieve consistently. Frank agreed to participate in Dr. Kellerman's research, undergoing extensive psychological testing and interview sessions designed to uncover details about his experience that might not have emerged during the police investigation. These sessions, conducted over several months, revealed disturbing inconsistencies in Frank's memory that troubled both him and the researcher. While Frank's conscious recollection of the evening's events remained consistent and detailed, hypnotic regression sessions revealed significant gaps and alternative narratives. Under hypnosis, Frank described periods where he felt disconnected from his own driving, as if he were observing his truck from outside the vehicle. He recalled conversations with individuals he couldn't describe and visits to locations that didn't correspond to any real places along his route. Most unsettling were the recovered memories of what Frank termed instruction sessions, where he apparently received detailed guidance about proper highway behavior from voices that seemed to come from his CB radio but weren't part of normal trucker communication. These voices, according to his hypnotically recovered memories, provided specific directions about speed, lane position, and following distances, as if he were being trained or tested rather than simply driving. The hypnotic sessions also revealed Frank's memory of multiple stops during his journey, visits to facilities that combined elements of truck stops with features that made no logical sense. He described fuel pumps that required no payment, restaurants staffed by individuals whose faces he couldn't see clearly, and parking areas filled with trucks that seemed familiar but belonged to no companies he could identify. Frank's family began noticing behavioral changes in the months following the incident. His wife Dorothy, whom he had married 26 years earlier, reported that he frequently woke in the middle of the night claiming to hear CB radio chatter in their bedroom. Frank would often get up to check his personal vehicle, insisting that he could hear his truck's engine running in their driveway, even though the truck was parked at his company's yard miles away. Dorothy also noticed that Frank had become obsessed with verifying his location during everyday activities. He would frequently check his cell phone's GPS while driving to familiar destinations, as if he could no longer trust his own sense of direction. Even more concerning was his habit of taking photographs of his truck before and after every trip, documenting its condition and location with an intensity that worried his family and coworkers. The case attracted attention from researchers in multiple fields as word spread through academic networks. Dr. James Mitchell, a psychologist at the University of Nebraska specializing in group behavior and mass hysteria, proposed that Frank's experience might represent a new form of highway-related psychological phenomenon. However, this theory struggled to explain the electronic logging device anomalies and the physical evidence that Deputy Chen had observed. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, a physicist at Iowa State University studying unconventional propulsion and optical phenomena, became intrigued by Frank's description of the pursuing vehicle's unusual lighting characteristics. Her analysis suggested that the headlight behavior Frank described violated several fundamental principles of optical physics, particularly regarding the relationship between light intensity, beam pattern, and shadow formation. In September 2020, nearly a year after the original incident, Frank experienced what he described as a follow-up encounter while driving the same route. This time, he immediately contacted authorities upon noticing a dark sedan maintaining position behind his truck. However, when sheriff's deputies arrived at the truck stop where Frank had pulled over, they found him alone in the parking lot with no other vehicles present. Security camera footage from the truck stop showed Frank's truck entering the lot alone, and Frank exhibiting behavior consistent with someone responding to the presence of another vehicle, despite no such vehicle being visible in the recordings. The cameras captured Frank speaking into his CB radio, gesturing toward empty areas of the parking lot, and repeatedly checking his mirrors as if monitoring a pursuing vehicle that existed only in his perception. This second incident prompted Dr. Kellerman to expand her research to include other drivers who might have experienced similar encounters. Her investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. Over the previous 5 years, at least 12 other commercial drivers had reported being followed by dark sedans with unusual lighting characteristics along various Iowa interstate corridors. The reports shared common elements that were too specific to be coincidental. The pursuing vehicles were consistently described as dark sedans with tinted windows. The headlights invariably showed an unusual bluish intensity that distinguished them from normal vehicle lighting. Most significantly, all of the reported encounters included the same predictive following behavior that Frank had described. The pursuing vehicle's apparent ability to anticipate the pursued driver's actions. Walter Davidson, a veteran trucker from Cedar Rapids, provided one of the most detailed accounts when he came forward in response to Dr. Kellerman's research. Walter described an encounter from December 2019 that occurred near the same location where Frank had first noticed his pursuer. The similarities were striking. A dark sedan with impossibly bright headlights, precise following behavior that lasted for over an hour, and the vehicle's disappearance when Walter pulled into a truck stop. Walter's account included additional details that added new dimensions to the phenomenon. According to Walter, the pursuing sedan had at one point pulled alongside his truck, allowing him to observe the vehicle more closely. He described the driver's side window as appearing to be down, but the interior remained completely dark despite the cab lighting that should have illuminated the driver. Most unsettling was his observation that the steering wheel appeared to be moving as if being operated by an invisible presence. Ruth Coleman, one of the few female drivers working the Iowa routes, reported an encounter from February 2020 that included elements none of the previous witnesses had mentioned. According to Ruth, the pursuing vehicle had somehow influenced her truck's electronic systems, causing her CB radio to receive transmissions from what appeared to be her own voice, providing route guidance and safety instructions. "It was definitely my voice," Ruth told Dr. Kellerman during a recorded interview. "But I wasn't speaking. The radio was playing back conversations I had apparently had with someone, but I had no memory of talking to anyone. It was like listening to myself from outside my own head." Ruth's truck was equipped with a more advanced electronic logging system than Frank's vehicle, and analysis of her data revealed even more dramatic anomalies. During her encounter, the system recorded her truck visiting 17 different locations across 3 states in a single evening, including several that were hundreds of miles from her actual route. The timestamps showed her truck apparently being in multiple places simultaneously, a physical impossibility that technical experts couldn't explain. Eugene Howards, a traffic safety investigator with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, became involved in the case in early 2021 when the pattern of reports reached federal attention. His review of the accumulated evidence identified several elements that troubled him from a regulatory perspective. When you have experienced commercial drivers with spotless safety records reporting identical, unusual encounters, Howards noted in his preliminary assessment, you have to consider the possibility that something is genuinely occurring that our current investigation methods aren't equipped to identify or explain. The FMCSA initiated a comprehensive review of electronic logging device data from all commercial vehicles that had traveled Iowa's interstate corridors during the time frame of reported encounters. This massive data analysis project involved examining millions of records from thousands of trucks to identify patterns that might explain the anomalous readings found in the trucks involved in the encounters. The results were deeply disturbing. The analysis revealed that approximately 3% of trucks traveling Iowa's interstate highways during nighttime hours showed similar anomalous ELD readings. These vehicles recorded impossible routes, time discrepancies, and location data that suggested they had visited places that either didn't exist or were inaccessible to commercial vehicles. Most significantly, the data analysis revealed that these anomalous readings clustered around specific times and locations, often corresponding to reported encounters with mysterious pursuing vehicles. The pattern suggested that whatever was causing individual drivers to experience these encounters was also affecting the electronic systems of their vehicles in predictable ways. Harold Grimm, a veteran trucker who had driven Iowa routes for over 30 years, provided perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence when he came forward in June 2021. Harold's truck was equipped with a comprehensive dashboard camera system that had been recording continuously during an encounter with a pursuing sedan. The footage captured nearly 40 minutes of what appeared to be a pursuit by a dark vehicle with unusual lighting characteristics. However, when investigators reviewed Harold's dashcam footage, they discovered something that challenged their understanding of the entire phenomenon. The pursuing vehicle was clearly visible in the camera's field of view, but it appeared to flicker or phase in and out of the image in ways that didn't correspond to normal optical effects or camera malfunctions. Technical analysis of Harold's footage by video experts from the FBI's forensic laboratory revealed what they described as impossible lighting conditions. The pursuing vehicle's headlights clearly illuminated Harold's truck and the surrounding roadway, creating visible light patterns on reflective surfaces. However, the same light sources created no corresponding shadows or reflections that should have been visible given the angle and intensity of the illumination. The sedan itself appeared solid and three-dimensional in the video, but exhibited characteristics that suggested it was somehow not entirely present in the physical environment. Most puzzling was the vehicle's interaction with other light sources. Overhead highway lighting passed through it without creating shadows, while its own headlights created normal illumination patterns on other objects. Dr. Margaret Sims, a physicist specializing in optical phenomena at the University of Iowa, conducted an extensive analysis of Harold's footage. Her conclusions, published in a preliminary report that was later classified by federal authorities, stated that the lighting effects captured in the video violated several fundamental principles of physics. Light doesn't behave the way it appears to behave in this footage, Dr. Sims explained in her report. We're observing illumination without corresponding photon interaction, shadows that don't match the light source position, and reflection patterns that suggest the light is originating from multiple points simultaneously, some of which appear to exist outside normal three-dimensional space. As word of these investigations spread through the trucking community, more drivers came forward with accounts of similar encounters. The reports expanded beyond Iowa to include incidents in Nebraska, Illinois, Missouri, and Kansas. But the I-80 corridor between Des Moines and Omaha remained the most frequently reported location. The geographical distribution suggested that the phenomenon was not limited to a single location, but might be part of a larger pattern affecting America's highway system. By late 2021, the accumulated evidence had attracted the attention of researchers from disciplines far outside traditional law enforcement and transportation safety. Dr. Robert Chang, a quantum physicist at Fermilab, became interested in the case after reviewing Dr. Sims' analysis of the optical anomalies captured in the dashcam footage. Dr. Chang's preliminary investigation focused on the possibility that the encounters might involve technology or phenomena that operated outside conventional understanding of physics and vehicle operation. His team's analysis of the electronic logging device data revealed patterns that suggested the affected vehicles might have been interacting with some form of field or energy source that could influence both electronic systems and human perception. What we're seeing in these cases, Dr. Chang explained in a confidential briefing to federal investigators, appears to be the signature of technology that can manipulate local space-time in ways that affect both electronic devices and human consciousness. The consistency of the reported effects suggests a systematic application of principles that are beyond our current scientific understanding. The case took on national security implications when it was discovered that several of the drivers who had reported encounters were hauling cargo for government contractors or transporting materials related to sensitive research projects. Frank Miller's own cargo manifest from the night of his encounter included irrigation equipment that was actually precision manufacturing components bound for a facility conducting classified research for the Department of Defense. Federal investigators from multiple agencies became involved, bringing resources and expertise that local and state authorities couldn't provide. However, their involvement also led to increased secrecy around the investigation, with many aspects of the case being classified under national security protocols. Frank Miller's life had been permanently altered by his experience that October night in 2019. Despite the ongoing investigation and the support of researchers like Dr. Kellerman, Frank struggled with the psychological impact of an encounter that defied explanation. He continued driving commercially, but never again alone and never at night on I-80. His employer, Heartland Distribution, eventually transferred him to shorter daytime routes that kept him closer to home, an accommodation that other affected drivers would later benefit from as well. The company's decision wasn't purely humanitarian. Heartland's insurance provider had reviewed Frank's case and the growing number of similar reports, concluding that drivers who had experienced these encounters represented an elevated risk for future incidents. The insurance industry's involvement brought additional resources to the investigation, but also increased pressure to find explanations that could be quantified and managed through conventional risk assessment methods. Frank became an unofficial spokesperson for drivers who had experienced similar encounters, providing support and validation for others who feared ridicule if they reported their experiences to authorities. His willingness to speak publicly about his encounter, despite potential professional consequences, encouraged other drivers to come forward with their own accounts. The support network that developed around these drivers revealed additional patterns that had not been apparent when the cases were considered individually. Many of the affected drivers reported similar psychological after-effects: sleep disturbances involving vivid dreams about driving, persistent anxiety when traveling familiar routes, and an obsessive need to verify their location and surroundings during routine activities. Dr. Helena Martinez, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma recovery, began working with affected drivers in early 2022. Her clinical assessment revealed that the psychological symptoms experienced by these drivers didn't match typical patterns associated with post-traumatic stress disorder or other recognized conditions. Instead, the drivers seemed to be experiencing what Dr. Martinez termed reality displacement anxiety, a condition characterized by persistent uncertainty about the reliability of their own perceptions and memories. These drivers aren't suffering from typical trauma responses, Dr. Martinez explained in her preliminary findings. They're dealing with the psychological impact of experiences that challenge their fundamental understanding of reality. The symptoms suggest that they've encountered something that exists outside their conceptual framework for understanding the world. The most recent documented encounter occurred in March 2023, when Harold Peterson, a 61-year-old driver with over 40 years of experience, reported being followed by a dark sedan for nearly 60 miles along I-80. Donald's account included new details that added to the growing understanding of these encounters, but also raised additional questions about the phenomenon's nature and purpose. According to Donald, the pursuing vehicle had at one point pulled alongside his truck, allowing him to observe its interior through what appeared to be an open passenger window. He described seeing what looked like a normally equipped car interior, complete with dashboard instruments and controls, but no visible driver. The steering wheel moved with precise, deliberate motions as if being operated by an invisible presence, while the speedometer and other gauges showed readings that corresponded to the vehicle's actual performance. Donald's encounter was notable for another reason. It was the first time multiple witnesses had observed the same pursuing vehicle simultaneously. Two other truckers traveling an informal convoy with Donald confirmed seeing the dark sedan and its unusual lighting effects. However, when all three trucks stopped at a rest area and the drivers compared their experiences, they realized they had been describing different details about the same vehicle. Each driver had observed the sedan from a different angle and distance, but their descriptions of its appearance, behavior, and lighting were inconsistent in ways that suggested each had seen a slightly different version of the same phenomenon. Donald described a black Crown Victoria with tinted windows, while his convoy partner Eugene Walters insisted it was a dark blue sedan with clear windows but no visible driver. The third driver, Betty Morrison, described what appeared to be a completely different vehicle entirely. A dark SUV with unusual light patterns that seemed to shift and change as she watched. Investigation of Donald's encounter revealed the most significant development in the case since Frank's original report. Analysis of GPS and communication data from all three trucks showed that the pursuing sedan had somehow interacted with their electronic systems in coordinated ways. During the pursuit, all three vehicles' CB radios had received transmissions on frequencies that were not in use by any licensed operators, and all three trucks' electronic logging devices had recorded similar anomalous data. The transmissions consisted of brief, coded messages that appeared to be coordinates and timestamps. Cryptographic analysis by the National Security Agency identified the encoding system as unlike any known civilian or military communication protocol. The coordinates referenced locations along I-80 where previous encounters had been reported, while the timestamps corresponded to the exact moments when pursuit behavior was observed by the drivers. Most unsettling was the discovery that the encoded messages had been transmitted several hours before the actual encounters occurred, suggesting that the pursuing vehicles had somehow anticipated when and where drivers would be traveling. This element of precognition challenged investigators' understanding of the phenomenon and suggested that whatever was responsible for these encounters operated according to principles that violated conventional understanding of causality and time. The federal investigation expanded significantly following Donald's encounter, with resources from the Department of Homeland Security, the National Security Agency, and several classified research agencies being brought to bear on the mystery. However, this increased attention also led to greater secrecy around the case, with many witnesses being required to sign non-disclosure agreements and submit to extensive background investigations. Frank Miller found himself at the center of this expanded investigation, undergoing interviews and examinations by specialists whose credentials and affiliations remained classified. The experience was both validating and disturbing. Validation that his encounter was being taken seriously by the highest levels of government, but disturbing in its implications about what that encounter might actually have involved. In late 2023, Frank received a visit from two federal agents who identified themselves only as representatives of a specialized research division. They provided him with a briefing that answered some questions about his encounter while raising many more. According to these agents, the phenomena he and other drivers had experienced were part of a larger pattern of encounters that had been occurring across the United States for several years. The agents revealed that similar reports had been documented in other parts of the country, always involving experienced drivers on major interstate highways, and always featuring the same elements: pursuing vehicles with impossible characteristics, electronic system anomalies, and memory inconsistencies. What made the Iowa cases unique was the level of documentation and the number of corroborating witnesses. However, the agents also informed Frank that the nature of the encounters remained classified, and that he would not be receiving additional information about the investigation's findings. They assured him that the phenomenon posed no threat to national security or public safety, but emphasized that discussing his experience in detail could compromise ongoing research efforts. Frank's reaction to this briefing was mixed. While he appreciated finally receiving some acknowledgement of the reality of his experience, the classified nature of the information left him with more questions than answers. The suggestion that similar encounters were occurring nationwide raised disturbing possibilities about the scope and purpose of whatever was responsible for these incidents. As of early 2024, the Iowa State Patrol maintains an active file on what has become known internally as the I-80 shadow phenomenon. The file contains over 60 reported encounters, hundreds of hours of video evidence, and thousands of pages of electronic logging device data that continue to defy conventional explanation. However, much of this information has been classified by federal authorities, leaving local investigators with limited ability to pursue the case independently. The public face of the investigation has been significantly scaled back, with official statements emphasizing the psychological aspects of the encounters rather than their physical evidence. This shift in focus has frustrated many of the affected drivers who feel that their experiences are being dismissed or minimized despite the substantial evidence supporting their accounts. Frank Miller still lives in Council Bluffs and continues to drive commercially on a limited basis, working only daytime routes within a 100-mile radius of his home. His relationship with long-haul trucking, once a source of pride and satisfaction, has been fundamentally altered by his encounter with something that challenged his understanding of reality itself. When asked about his experience and its aftermath, Frank's response reflects the resigned acceptance of someone who has learned that some questions may never receive satisfactory answers. "I know what I saw that night," Frank says, "and I know it wasn't normal. But whether it was something from outside our understanding or something from inside my own mind, I can't say for certain anymore. What I can say is that it changed how I think about the road, about being alone out there in the dark. There are things moving on our highways that don't follow the rules we think we understand, whether they're from some government program, some foreign country, or somewhere else entirely, I don't know. But they're out there, and they're watching us." The I-80 corridor between Des Moines and Omaha remains one of the busiest freight routes in the Midwest. Every night, hundreds of commercial drivers traverse this stretch of highway, carrying the goods that keep America's economy moving. Most complete their journeys without incident, but a growing number report encounters that challenge their understanding of what is possible on the familiar roads they have traveled for years. For the drivers who have experienced these encounters, the phenomenon represents more than just an unsolved mystery. It has fundamentally altered their relationship with the profession they have dedicated their lives to, introducing an element of uncertainty into what was once predictable and controllable. They continue to drive because the nation's economy depends on them, but they do so with the knowledge that the highways they thought they knew completely may harbor presences that exist beyond current understanding. The official investigation continues, though much of it now occurs within classified channels that provide no public information or reassurance. New encounters are still reported regularly, with the same consistent elements that have characterized the phenomenon since Frank's original experience. Whether these encounters represent advanced surveillance technology, experimental aircraft, interdimensional visitors, or something else entirely remains unknown to all but the most highly classified levels of government. Dorothy Miller, Frank's wife of 26 years, perhaps summarized the lasting impact of the I-80 shadow phenomenon most accurately when she observed, "It's not just that Frank saw something he couldn't explain. It's that he learned there are things out there that can't be explained, and once you know that, you can never feel completely safe again. For Frank himself, the most disturbing aspect of his experience wasn't the encounter itself, but the realization of how little control he actually had over his own perceptions and memories. The discovery that his truck's electronic systems had recorded a journey completely different from his conscious experience raised fundamental questions about the reliability of human consciousness and the nature of reality itself. As October approaches each year, Frank still thinks about that night in 2019 when everything changed. The memory remains as vivid as ever. The impossibly bright headlights in his mirrors, the precise following behavior of an unknown driver, and the moment when a routine haul became something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Whether the shadow that followed him that night was real or imagined, technological or supernatural, terrestrial or otherwise, he can never know for certain. But on the empty stretches of I-80, in the darkness between the distant lights of small Iowa towns, the possibility that it might still be out there continues to cast its own shadow over every mile he drives. The phenomenon has fundamentally changed how many drivers approach their profession, particularly those who work the overnight routes through isolated areas. Companies have implemented new communication protocols requiring more frequent check-ins, and many drivers have modified their routes to avoid the most commonly reported encounter locations. The broader implications of the I-80 shadow phenomenon extend beyond the trucking industry into questions about the nature of reality, the reliability of perception, and the extent to which our understanding of the physical world might be incomplete. For the drivers who have experienced these encounters, these philosophical questions have practical consequences that affect their daily lives and their ability to perform the jobs that once defined their identities. Frank Miller's story serves as a reminder that the familiar highways we travel daily may harbor mysteries that challenge our understanding of what is possible. Whether those mysteries represent natural phenomena we don't yet understand, advanced technology beyond current public knowledge, or something else entirely, they continue to affect the lives of those who encounter them. The trucking community, known for its practical approach to problems and its skepticism toward unexplained phenomena, has been forced to confront the possibility that some aspects of their profession involve elements that cannot be easily categorized or explained. This confrontation has strengthened bonds between drivers while also introducing new anxieties about the reliability of their own experiences. As the investigation continues in its classified channels, the affected drivers remain caught between their desire for answers and their need to continue working in an industry that demands both practical competence and psychological stability. They have learned to live with uncertainty, to function despite questions that may never be answered, and to find meaning in their work despite encounters that challenge their understanding of the world they thought they knew. The legacy of Frank Miller's encounter on that October night in 2019 continues to ripple through the American trucking industry, raising questions that extend far beyond transportation safety into the fundamental nature of reality itself. Whether those questions will ever be answered remains unknown, but their existence has permanently altered the landscape of American highway travel and the experiences of those who make their living on the road. In the end, the I-80 shadow phenomenon stands as a testament to the mysteries that may still exist in our increasingly mapped and monitored world, and to the courage of those who report experiences that challenge conventional understanding despite the personal costs of doing so. Frank Miller's willingness to speak about his encounter, despite professional risks and personal psychological trauma, has helped other drivers realize they are not alone in their experiences, and has contributed to a growing body of evidence that suggests our highways may be home to phenomena that we are only beginning to understand. Earl Hutchinson had been pulling into the same truck stop for nearly 7 years when he noticed the first anomaly. The Desert Star Travel Plaza, positioned at the intersection of Highway 287 and Interstate 40 in eastern New Mexico, had become as familiar to Earl as his own driveway back in Amarillo. Every Tuesday night, without fail, the 58-year-old independent owner-operator would arrive between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, fuel up his white Freightliner Cascadia, grab a quick dinner, and catch exactly 6 hours of sleep before continuing his weekly run from Texas cattle ranches to Colorado processing plants. The routine had developed organically over his 16 years of hauling livestock. The Desert Star's location provided the perfect break point in his 740-mile journey, and the truck stop's facilities were adequate without being fancy. Clean restrooms, decent food, and most importantly, a quiet parking area where the constant rumble of refrigerated trailers wouldn't keep him awake. Earl prided himself on maintaining schedules that allowed his cargo, usually young cattle being transported to feedlots, to experience minimal stress during transport. On the night of March 17, 2020, Earl's routine began exactly as it had 347 times before. He completed his pre-trip inspection at the Panhandle Livestock Cooperative outside Amarillo at 4:15 p.m., loaded 43 Angus yearlings into his specialized livestock trailer, and departed at 5:23 p.m. for the overnight haul to Greeley, Colorado. The cattle were healthy and calm, the weather forecast showed clear skies, and Earl's truck was running with the mechanical precision that came from meticulous maintenance. The first 4 hours of the drive proceeded normally. Earl made his scheduled check-ins with dispatch, monitored his cargo through the trailer's internal camera system, and maintained the steady 63-mile-per-hour pace that provided optimal fuel efficiency while ensuring his animals' comfort. The cattle had settled into the transport routine quickly, clustering together in the trailer's padded compartments with minimal vocalization, a sign that Earl had loaded them properly and that the ride was proceeding smoothly. At 9:47 p.m., Earl pulled off Interstate 40 at exit 277, following the familiar 2-mile access road that led to the Desert Star Travel Plaza. The truck stop's neon sign was visible from miles away across the flat New Mexico landscape, a beacon of civilization in an otherwise empty stretch of high desert. As he navigated the entrance ramp into the facility's parking area, Earl noticed that the lot was unusually empty for a Tuesday night. Typically, 15 to 20 big rigs would be parked in the overnight section, but tonight he counted only 4 other trucks scattered across the expansive asphalt lot. Earl attributed the light traffic to the ongoing disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, which had significantly reduced freight volume across most shipping corridors. Many independent drivers had been forced out of business, while others had modified their routes to avoid potential exposure in crowded truck stops. Earl himself had considered changing his routine, but the Desert Star's isolated location and traditionally low traffic made it seem safer than the larger facilities along more traveled routes. After positioning his truck in his usual spot, the third space in the back row, where his cattle would be sheltered from the prevailing wind, Earl completed his post-drive inspection and headed toward the main building. The Desert Star consisted of a fuel station, a small convenience store, and a diner that served basic truck stop fare 24 hours a day. Earl's routine involved fueling first, then ordering his standard meal of chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, and coffee while reviewing his logbook and planning the next day's schedule. The fuel island was deserted, which wasn't unusual for the late hour. Earl had his own commercial fuel card and was accustomed to self-service even when attendants were available. As he began the fueling process, he noticed that the pump's digital display was flickering occasionally, showing brief flashes of numbers that didn't correspond to gallons pumped or cost per gallon. The anomaly was minor, probably just an aging display with loose connections, but Earl made a mental note to mention it to the management. While his tanks filled with the slow, steady flow that characterized high-volume commercial pumps, Earl walked around his truck to check on his cargo. The cattle had settled completely, with most lying down in the comfortable bedding he had provided. Their breathing was regular and unstressed, and the trailer's ventilation system was maintaining optimal temperature and air circulation. Everything appeared normal, but Earl noticed something that struck him as odd. The usual sounds of a truck stop at night were absent. Truck stops, even quiet ones like the Desert Star, typically generated a constant low-level noise. The hum of refrigerated trailers, the distant rumble of idling engines, occasional CB radio chatter from open cab windows, and the general mechanical sounds of commercial vehicles. Tonight, however, the parking lot was strangely silent, except for the sound of his own truck's auxiliary power unit and the soft lowing of his cattle. Earl completed his fueling and moved his truck to the overnight parking area, where he engaged the parking brake and began his shutdown routine. This process involved securing his cargo, updating his electronic logbook, and setting up his sleeper cab for the night. As he worked through these familiar tasks, he gradually became aware that the silence around the truck stop was not just unusual, it was complete. Even his own cattle, normally vocal during the first hour after stopping, had become completely quiet. The diner occupied the left side of the Desert Star's main building, accessible through a glass door marked with faded decals advertising various trucking services and fuel brands. Earl had eaten in this diner hundreds of times and knew its layout by heart. A counter with 8 stools facing an open kitchen, 6 booths along the windows overlooking the parking lot, and a small seating area with tables near the entrance. The staff typically consisted of 1 cook and 1 waitress during the overnight shift, though Earl had noticed recent staffing had been inconsistent due to the pandemic. As Earl approached the diner entrance at 11:15 p.m., he could see through the windows that the interior was brightly lit and appeared to be open for business. However, something about the scene inside seemed off, though he couldn't immediately identify what was troubling him. The tables and booths were empty, which was normal for the late hour, but the lighting seemed somehow different from his previous visits. Brighter and more uniform, without the shadows and variations that typically characterized the space. Earl pushed through the entrance door, expecting to hear the familiar electronic chime that announced customer arrivals. Instead, the door opened silently, and he found himself in a diner that was simultaneously familiar and subtly wrong. The layout was exactly as he remembered: counter, booths, tables, but the details were somehow different in ways that his mind struggled to process. The waitress station behind the counter was occupied by a woman Earl didn't recognize, though staff turnover at remote truck stops was common enough that this wasn't necessarily significant. She appeared to be middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back in a practical style, wearing the standard uniform of dark slacks and a white shirt that characterized food service workers throughout the Southwest. When she looked up at Earl's entrance, her smile was professional and welcoming, but her eyes seemed to focus on a point slightly to his left rather than meeting his gaze directly. "Evening, hun," she said in a voice that carried the slight accent typical of eastern New Mexico. "You're right on time. Coffee and the usual?" Earl paused, confused by her greeting. While he was indeed a regular customer, the staff had never demonstrated such familiarity with his specific order or schedule. The previous waitresses had been friendly but professional, requiring him to place his order each visit rather than assuming his preferences. This level of personal attention, while not necessarily unwelcome, struck him as unusual. "I'm sorry," Earl said, settling onto his regular stool at the counter. "Have we met before? I don't think I remember you from my previous stops here." The waitress continued smiling, but her expression seemed to freeze in place rather than respond naturally to his question. After a moment that lasted slightly too long, she said, "Oh, I've been here for years, hun. Just probably missed each other before. Coffee's fresh, and Jake's got your chicken fried steak ready to go." Earl glanced toward the kitchen area where he could see a cook working over the grill. The man appeared to be middle-aged and competent, wearing the standard white apron and paper hat that characterized truck stop cooks. However, Earl couldn't see the cook's face clearly, as the man seemed to be consistently turned away from the counter, focused intently on his work. "That's quite a coincidence," Earl said, accepting the coffee cup the waitress placed before him. "I've been stopping here every Tuesday night for almost 7 years, and I always order the same thing. I'm surprised we haven't crossed paths before." The coffee was exactly as Earl preferred it, strong, hot, and black, but something about its taste seemed slightly different from his previous visits. Not unpleasant, but somehow more intense, as if the familiar flavor had been concentrated or refined. Earl attributed this to possible changes in the coffee supplier or brewing methods, common adjustments during economically challenging times. The waitress moved efficiently behind the counter, performing the routine tasks of refilling condiment containers and wiping down surfaces, but her movements seemed oddly repetitive and mechanical. Earl noticed that she was completing the same sequence of actions over and over. Wipe the counter, refill the sugar dispenser, arrange the salt and pepper shakers, then begin the sequence again. Each cycle took exactly 90 seconds, and each movement was identical to the previous iteration. "Busy night?" Earl asked, hoping to break the strange rhythm of her activities. "Oh, you know how it is," the waitress replied without pausing in her routine. "Same as always, really. Quiet Tuesday evening, just the regulars passing through." Earl looked around the empty diner, noting that he was the only customer present. "Seems pretty quiet tonight. I noticed the parking lot's not as full as usual." The waitress's smile remained unchanged as she continued her repetitive tasks. "Oh, everyone's here, hon. They're all exactly where they're supposed to be." This response puzzled Earl, as it didn't correspond to his observation of the nearly empty parking lot. He decided to let the conversation drop and focus on his meal, which the cook was apparently preparing in the kitchen. Earl could hear the sounds of cooking, the sizzle of meat on the grill, the clatter of utensils, the hiss of oil in hot pans. But the noises seemed strangely amplified and precisely timed, as if they were being produced for his benefit rather than as natural byproducts of food preparation. While waiting for his dinner, Earl reviewed his logbook and calculated his remaining driving time for the following day. The familiar ritual of updating his records and planning his route helped restore his sense of normalcy, though he remained vaguely troubled by the subtle strangeness of his surroundings. The diner looked right, sounded right, and smelled right, but something fundamental felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. At 11:31 p.m., the cook emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate that held Earl's usual order: chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a dinner roll. The presentation was exactly as Earl expected, and the portions were generous without being wasteful. However, when the cook set the plate before him, Earl found himself looking directly into the man's face for the first time that evening. The cook's features were completely ordinary, neither handsome nor unattractive, neither young nor old. He appeared to be in his 40s or 50s, with short brown hair and a clean-shaven face that showed the slight tan typical of men who worked in the Southwest. But despite these normal characteristics, Earl found it difficult to focus on the cook's face, as if his features were somehow unstable or shifting when observed directly. "There you go, sir," the cook said in a voice that was pleasant and unremarkable. "Enjoy your meal." Earl thanked him and began eating, finding that the food was prepared exactly to his taste. The chicken fried steak was tender and well seasoned, the mashed potatoes were smooth and properly salted, and the green beans were cooked to the precise level of firmness he preferred. Everything was perfect, perhaps too perfect, as if his meal had been prepared according to specifications he had never provided. As Earl ate, he became increasingly aware that the waitress had stopped her repetitive routine and was now standing motionless behind the counter, watching him with that same unfocused gaze. Her smile remained in place, but her eyes seemed to be tracking his movements with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. When he looked directly at her, she would resume her cleaning activities. But the moment he returned his attention to his food, she would stop and resume watching. The cook had returned to the kitchen, but appeared to be moving around behind the service window in patterns that seemed designed to remain just outside Earl's direct line of sight. Occasionally, Earl would catch glimpses of white apron or the movement of cooking utensils, but whenever he tried to observe the kitchen directly, the cook would seem to vanish into blind spots that shouldn't have existed in such a small space. Earl finished his meal at 11:47 p.m. and signaled for his check. The waitress approached with a receipt that showed the exact amount Earl always paid, including his standard tip, though she hadn't yet calculated the total or processed his payment. The receipt was handwritten in neat script that looked familiar, though Earl couldn't remember seeing the waitress write anything during his visit. "Same as always, hun," she said, sliding the receipt across the counter. "Cash or card tonight?" Earl always paid cash, as he had during every previous visit, but the waitress's question suggested she wasn't as familiar with his habits as she had initially claimed. He placed $35 on the counter, the exact amount due, including tip, and stood to leave. "Thanks for the meal," Earl said. "I'll see you next Tuesday." The waitress's smile broadened, and for the first time that evening, her eyes seemed to focus directly on his face. "Oh yes, hun. Next Tuesday. Same time, same everything. We'll be right here waiting for you." Earl left the diner and walked across the parking lot toward his truck, feeling a sense of relief as he put distance between himself and the strangely intense atmosphere of the restaurant. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the familiar sense of diesel fuel and high desert vegetation that he associated with this part of his route. However, as he approached his truck, Earl noticed that the parking lot was no longer empty. All of the overnight parking spaces were now occupied by trucks, though Earl had no memory of additional vehicles arriving while he was eating. The trucks appeared to be typical big rigs, various makes and models of semi-tractors pulling different types of trailers. Most were parked with their running lights off, suggesting their drivers were sleeping, but a few showed the glow of interior lighting from their sleeper compartments. Earl walked between the parked trucks toward his own vehicle, noting that most of the rigs appeared to be older models, though all were well-maintained and properly positioned in their spaces. The license plates he could see represented various states throughout the Midwest and Southwest, typical of the traffic patterns through this part of New Mexico. Everything appeared normal, but Earl was troubled by his failure to notice the truck's arrival during his 47-minute dinner. As he reached his own truck, Earl could hear his cattle moving restlessly in the trailer, vocalizing with the low, urgent sounds that indicated stress or discomfort. This was unusual, as his animals typically remained calm throughout overnight stops. Earl climbed into the trailer through the side access door to check on his cargo, using his flashlight to examine the cattle without startling them further. The 43 yearlings appeared to be healthy and uninjured, but they were clearly agitated about something in their environment. Most were standing and facing toward the rear of the trailer, as if focused on something outside that Earl couldn't identify. Their breathing was rapid and shallow, and several were showing signs of the stress behaviors that Earl had learned to recognize during his years of livestock transport. Earl spent 20 minutes in the trailer, checking each animal individually and ensuring that their water and feed were adequate. The cattle gradually calmed under his presence, but they remained more alert and nervous than was typical for animals that had been traveling for several hours. Earl made notes in his logbook about their condition and decided to monitor them more closely than usual during the remainder of the journey. After securing the trailer and completing his pre-sleep routine, Earl climbed into his sleeper compartment and attempted to settle in for his standard 6 hours of rest. His sleeper was efficiently organized, with a comfortable mattress, adequate climate control, and the personal items that made long-haul trucking tolerable: family photos, a small television, and several books he was working through during his overnight stops. However, sleep proved elusive, as Earl became aware of sounds from the parking lot that didn't match his expectations for a truck stop at midnight. Instead of the typical mixture of idling engines, auxiliary power units, and occasional CB radio chatter, he heard what sounded like organized activity, multiple engines starting and stopping in sequence, the hydraulic hiss of air brakes being engaged and released, and the occasional sound of trailer doors being opened and closed. Earl checked his watch. 12:23 a.m. This was an unusual time for commercial drivers to be conducting business, as most would either be sleeping or departing early in the morning. Loading and unloading activities typically occurred during business hours, and truck stops generally discouraged noisy operations during overnight periods. Earl considered investigating, but decided that the activity was probably related to time-sensitive freight that required unusual scheduling. The sounds continued for approximately 30 minutes, following patterns that seemed too organized and repetitive to represent normal trucking activities. Earl could distinguish individual vehicles starting up and moving through the parking lot, but the movements didn't correspond to trucks departing the facility. Instead, the vehicles seemed to be repositioning themselves within the lot, changing parking spaces according to some system Earl couldn't understand. At 12:51 a.m., the mechanical noises stopped abruptly, leaving the parking lot in the same complete silence that had characterized Earl's arrival. Earl waited for several minutes, listening for the normal background sounds of a truck stop, but heard only the quiet operation of his own truck's systems and the now calm breathing of his cattle. Earl finally managed to fall asleep around 1:15 a.m., but his rest was interrupted by vivid and unsettling dreams. In these dreams, he was driving his truck through a landscape that resembled the New Mexico desert, but contained elements that didn't belong, roads that led in impossible directions, truck stops that were simultaneously familiar and completely foreign, and cattle that spoke in human voices about journeys they couldn't remember taking. The most disturbing dream involved Earl walking through the Desert Star Travel Plaza, but the facility was vastly larger than in reality, containing endless corridors lined with identical diners. In each diner, the same waitress served the same meal to the same trucker, while the same cook prepared identical orders in kitchen after kitchen. Earl realized that he was the trucker in each scene, eating the same chicken fried steak over and over again while the waitress smiled and said, "Same as always, hun." Earl woke at 5:30 a.m., 30 minutes earlier than usual, feeling less rested than he should have after several hours of sleep. The parking lot was quiet, and dawn was beginning to illuminate the high desert landscape surrounding the truck stop. Earl completed his wake-up routine, checked on his cattle, and prepared for departure, noting that his animals seemed to have returned to their normal calm state during the night. As Earl prepared to leave his parking space, he noticed that the other trucks that had filled the lot during the night were no longer present. The parking area was once again nearly empty, containing only the same 4 trucks he had observed upon his arrival. Earl was certain that more than 20 vehicles had been parked in the lot during the night, but no evidence of their presence remained except for tire marks in the dust that might have been created by any number of previous visitors. Earl completed his pre-trip inspection and departed the Desert Star Travel Plaza at 6:15 a.m., continuing his journey toward Colorado. The remainder of his trip proceeded normally, with his cattle arriving at their destination in excellent condition and his delivery being completed on schedule. However, Earl remained troubled by the strange elements of his overnight stop, though he couldn't identify any specific problems or violations of normal trucking protocols. The following Tuesday, March 24th, Earl approached his regular stop at the Desert Star with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He was curious to see if the previous week's unusual experiences had been anomalies, or if something fundamental had changed about the facility. His cattle transport schedule required him to maintain his regular timing, but Earl decided to pay closer attention to details that he might have previously overlooked. Earl arrived at the Desert Star at 11:35 p.m., 5 minutes later than his usual schedule due to slightly heavier traffic through Amarillo. The parking lot configuration was exactly as he had left it the previous week. 4 trucks scattered across the overnight area, positioned in the same spaces they had occupied 7 days earlier. Earl parked in his regular spot and completed his fueling routine, noting that the pump's digital display continued to show the same occasional flickering he had observed during his previous visit. The diner appeared normal as Earl approached the entrance with the same bright uniform lighting he had noticed the week before. When he pushed through the door, he found the same waitress standing behind the counter in exactly the same position, wearing identical clothing and displaying the same professional smile. Her greeting was word for word identical to her previous week's welcome. "Evening, hun. You're right on time. Coffee and the usual?" Earl decided to test the situation by deviating from his normal routine. "Actually," he said, settling onto a different stool than his regular position, "I think I'll try something different tonight. What kind of pie do you have?" The waitress's smile remained unchanged, but she seemed to experience a moment of confusion, as if his question didn't correspond to any response she was prepared to give. After a pause that lasted several seconds, she said, "Oh, I think you want your usual, hun. Coffee and the chicken fried steak. Jake's got it ready for you." Earl looked toward the kitchen, where the same cook was working at the grill in the same position he had occupied the previous week. The sounds of cooking were identical. The same sequence of sizzles, clatters, and hisses that had seemed so precisely timed during his previous visit. Earl realized that he was hearing exactly the same kitchen noises, reproduced with mechanical precision. "I'm sure the chicken fried steak is excellent," Earl said, "but I was hoping to try something different. Maybe a burger or just coffee and pie." The waitress continued smiling, but her eyes developed the same unfocused quality Earl had noticed the previous week. She began the same repetitive routine of wiping the counter, refilling the sugar dispenser, and arranging condiments, completing each 90-second cycle with identical movements. "Coffee's fresh," she said, pouring a cup and placing it before Earl. "And Jake's got your usual ready to go." Earl accepted the coffee, which tasted exactly the same as it had the previous week, strong, hot, and somehow more intense than normal coffee. As he sipped it, the cook emerged from the kitchen carrying the same plate. Chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, green beans, and dinner roll, prepared and presented identically to the previous week's meal. "There you go, sir," the cook said, setting the plate before Earl. "Enjoy your meal." Earl studied the cook's face, noting the same difficulty focusing on the man's features that he had experienced the previous week. The cook's appearance was completely ordinary, yet somehow unmemorable, as if his face couldn't quite achieve permanent form in Earl's perception. "Thank you," Earl said, "but I didn't order this. I was hoping to see a menu, maybe try something different." The cook's expression didn't change as he said, "Enjoy your meal, sir," and returned to the kitchen. Earl realized that both the cook and waitress were responding to him as if he had placed his usual order, regardless of what he actually said. Earl decided to eat the meal rather than continue trying to communicate with staff who seemed unable to process any deviation from their expected script. The food was identical to the previous week's dinner. Same preparation, same seasoning, same temperature. Everything was perfect according to his preferences, prepared as if according to specifications he had never provided. As Earl ate, he observed the same behaviors he had noticed during his previous visit. The waitress watching him with unfocused intensity whenever she thought he wasn't looking. The cook moving through the kitchen in patterns designed to remain just outside direct observation, and the overall atmosphere of a scene being performed rather than lived. Earl finished his meal at exactly 11:47 p.m., the same time as the previous week. The waitress approached with an identical receipt showing the same total, written in the same neat script. Her words were exactly the same. "Same as always, hun. Cash or card tonight. Earl paid the same $35 and stood to leave, feeling a growing sense of unease about the mechanical precision of the entire encounter. As he reached the door, the waitress called after him with the same words as the previous week. "Oh yes, hun, next Tuesday. Same time, same everything. We'll be right here waiting for you." Outside in the parking lot, Earl found the same transformation that had occurred the previous week. The 4 trucks that had been present during his arrival had been joined by approximately 20 additional vehicles, all parked in overnight spaces with no evidence of when or how they had arrived. Earl walked among the trucks, noting that they appeared to be the same vehicles in the same positions he had observed the previous week. Earl's cattle were exhibiting the same stress behaviors as the previous week, standing and facing toward the rear of the trailer while vocalizing their discomfort. Earl spent the same 20 minutes checking on his animals, making the same notations in his logbook, and observing the same gradual calming of his cargo under his presence. The sounds from the parking lot followed the same pattern as the previous week. Organized activity beginning around 12:23 a.m., with engines starting and stopping in sequence, air brakes engaging and releasing, and trailer doors opening and closing. The activity continued for exactly 30 minutes before stopping abruptly, leaving the lot in complete silence. Earl's sleep was again disrupted by the same vivid dreams of endless truck stop corridors and repetitive dining experiences. He woke at 5:30 a.m. to find the parking lot restored to its original configuration, with only the original 4 trucks remaining and no evidence of the additional vehicles that had occupied the space during the night. Over the following weeks, Earl's Tuesday night stops at the Desert Star Travel Plaza became exercises in documenting a phenomenon he couldn't explain. Each visit was identical to the previous one. Same arrival time, same parking lot configuration, same diner experience with the same staff providing the same meal and conversation. The waitress always greeted him as if he were arriving exactly on schedule, the cook always had his usual meal prepared, and the check always totaled exactly $35. Earl began taking photographs of the parking lot before and after his dinner, documenting the mysterious appearance and disappearance of the additional trucks. The images showed the same vehicles in the same positions week after week, as if the entire scene were being reset to identical specifications each Tuesday night. Most disturbing was Earl's growing realization that he was becoming part of the pattern. Despite his conscious efforts to vary his routine, arriving at different times, ordering different food, taking different routes through the facility, he found himself completing exactly the same sequence of actions each week. Even when he tried to skip the stop entirely, he would find himself pulling into the Desert Star's parking lot at 11:30 p.m., as if his truck were following the route independently of his conscious decisions. Earl's cattle began showing signs of chronic stress that couldn't be attributed to normal transport conditions. Despite his careful attention to their comfort and health, the animals were becoming increasingly agitated during the weekly stops at the Desert Star. Earl consulted with veterinarians and livestock transport specialists, but none could identify a cause for his animals' distress. The psychological impact on Earl was equally troubling. He found himself thinking about the Desert Star Travel Plaza constantly during the weeks between visits, analyzing every detail of his experiences and searching for rational explanations that continued to elude him. His sleep became increasingly disturbed, not just during his overnight stops, but throughout the week, as dreams of repetitive truck stop encounters invaded his rest. Earl's wife, Margaret, began noticing changes in his behavior and demeanor. He became obsessed with documenting his weekly routine, taking extensive notes and photographs that he would study for hours at their kitchen table. Margaret found his descriptions of the identical experiences difficult to believe, particularly his insistence that the staff always knew his order in advance, and that the same trucks appeared and disappeared from the parking lot each week. "Maybe you should try a different route," Margaret suggested during one of Earl's detailed recountings of his Tuesday night experiences. There are other truck stops along that corridor. You don't have to stop at the same place every week. Earl had considered this option many times, but whenever Tuesday evening approached, he found himself irresistibly drawn to the Desert Star Travel Plaza. He would begin his journey with firm intentions to stop elsewhere, but his truck would inevitably follow the familiar exit ramp to the facility he had come to dread and anticipate in equal measure. In May 2020, Earl decided to bring a witness to verify his experiences. He arranged for his longtime friend and fellow trucker, Walter Brennan, to follow him on one of his Tuesday runs. Walter was a practical, skeptical man who had been driving for over 20 years and had little patience for unexplained phenomena or supernatural speculation. Walter followed Earl's truck to the Desert Star Travel Plaza, arriving just after Earl had completed his fueling routine. However, when Walter entered the diner, he found it closed and dark, with a handwritten sign on the door indicating that the restaurant was undergoing maintenance and would reopen the following week. Walter waited in the parking lot while Earl completed what appeared to be a normal dinner routine. But from Walter's perspective, Earl was sitting alone in an empty, darkened restaurant for 47 minutes. When Earl emerged from the diner, he described his usual experience: the familiar waitress, the prepared meal, the identical conversation and payment routine. Walter insisted that the restaurant had been closed and that Earl had been sitting alone in a dark building. Both men were certain of their own observations, but their accounts of the same time frame were completely incompatible. Walter's presence seemed to break the pattern that had been governing Earl's stops. When they checked the parking lot after Earl's dinner, the additional trucks that usually appeared remained absent. Earl's cattle showed no signs of stress, and the organized mechanical activity that typically occurred around midnight never materialized. Earl slept normally and woke refreshed, feeling that the strange hold the Desert Star had maintained over his routine had finally been broken. However, the following Tuesday, Earl found himself once again compelled to stop at the Desert Star Travel Plaza. Walter was not available to accompany him, and Earl's attempts to contact other drivers who might serve as witnesses were unsuccessful. When he arrived at the truck stop, the familiar pattern resumed exactly as it had been before Walter's visit. Identical staff, identical meal, identical conversation, and identical mysterious activity in the parking lot. Earl's growing desperation led him to contact the truck stop's corporate ownership, seeking information about the staff and operations at the Desert Star Travel Plaza. The corporate office informed him that the facility had been closed for renovation since February 2020 and was not expected to reopen until late 2021. According to their records, no staff were currently employed at the location, and the restaurant had not been serving food for several months. Earl drove to the Desert Star during daylight hours on a Thursday afternoon to investigate the corporate office's claims. He found the facility exactly as he had seen it during his Tuesday night visits, fully operational, well-maintained, and apparently open for business. The fuel pumps were functional, the parking lot was in good condition, and the diner appeared to be operating normally through its windows. When Earl contacted the corporate office again to report his observations, they insisted that their records were accurate and that the facility remained closed. They provided him with photographs taken by a security service that showed the Desert Star as it actually existed, partially demolished, with broken windows, damaged fuel pumps, and construction equipment staged around the property. Earl compared the corporate photographs with his own images taken during the same time frame and found them to show completely different views of the same location. His photographs showed a fully operational truck stop, while the corporate images documented a facility that had been under demolition for months. The contradiction between Earl's experiences and the documented reality of the Desert Star Travel Plaza forced him to confront the possibility that his Tuesday night stops were not occurring in the same physical reality that he inhabited during the rest of the week. This realization was both terrifying and liberating, as it suggested that his inability to break the pattern might not be a failure of willpower, but a consequence of forces beyond his control. Earl continued his Tuesday night visits through the summer and fall of 2020, documenting each identical experience while searching for some variation or clue that might explain the phenomenon. The pattern never changed. Same arrival time, same staff, same meal, same payment, same mysterious parking lot activity, and same restoration to normal conditions by morning. The psychological strain of living with this weekly anomaly began affecting every aspect of Earl's life. His other trucking runs became exercises in hypervigilance, as he searched for signs that other locations might be similarly compromised. His relationship with Margaret deteriorated as she struggled to understand and support him through an experience that challenged conventional understanding of reality. Earl's cattle transport business began suffering as his animals showed increasing signs of chronic stress that affected their market value and his reputation among livestock cooperatives. Several clients began requesting different drivers, and Earl found himself losing contracts that had sustained his independent operation for years. In December 2020, Earl made the difficult decision to sell his truck and retire from long-haul trucking. However, his final run was scheduled for a Tuesday, and despite his intentions to complete a different route, he found himself once again pulling into the Desert Star Travel Plaza at 11:30 p.m. The familiar waitress greeted him with the same words she had used for months. "Evening, hon. You're right on time. Coffee and the usual?" But this time, Earl noticed a subtle difference in her expression. Her smile seemed sadder, and her unfocused gaze appeared to be looking directly at him for the first time since his visits had begun. When she brought his coffee, she lingered at his place at the counter. "This is your last time, isn't it, hon?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine emotion that had been absent from all their previous interactions. Earl was startled by this break in the script that had governed their encounters. "How did you know that?" he asked. The waitress's smile became more natural, less mechanically perfect than it had been during their previous meetings. "We always know when it's the last time," she said. "It's part of the pattern. Things have to complete their cycles." "What is this place?" Earl asked. "What's been happening to me here?" The waitress glanced toward the kitchen where the cook continued his repetitive food preparation routine. "It's a junction, hun. A place where different paths cross. Some folks pass through without noticing, but others get caught in the crossing. You've been stuck in a loop for months, but loops always end eventually." "Why couldn't I stop coming here? Why couldn't I change anything?" "Some people need to experience the same thing over and over until they understand what it means," the waitress explained. "You've been learning about patterns, about how routines can become prisons. Now that you understand, you can choose differently." Earl ate his final chicken-fried steak dinner at the Desert Star Travel Plaza, but this time the food tasted different, more like normal truck stop fare than the unnaturally perfect meals he had been served for months. When he finished, the waitress brought him a check that showed a different total than usual, written in handwriting that looked genuinely human rather than mechanically precise. "Thank you," Earl said as he paid. "For everything. I think I understand now." The waitress nodded, her smile warm and authentic. "Drive safe, hon. And remember, patterns are only prisons if you don't recognize them for what they are." Earl left the diner and walked to his truck, noticing that the parking lot remained in its original configuration throughout the night. His cattle were calm and quiet, showing none of the stress behaviors that had characterized their previous stops. Earl slept deeply and dreamlessly, waking naturally at 6 a.m., feeling more rested than he had in months. When Earl departed the Desert Star Travel Plaza for the final time, he looked back in his mirrors to see the facility exactly as the corporate photographs had shown it, partially demolished, with broken windows and construction equipment surrounding the property. The operational truck stop he had visited for months existed only in his rearview mirrors for a few seconds before fading into the morning desert landscape. Earl completed his final livestock delivery and sold his truck the following week, using the proceeds to purchase a small ranch outside Amarillo, where he could raise cattle instead of transporting them. Margaret supported his decision, relieved to see him free from the weekly compulsion that had dominated their lives for months. However, Earl's connection to the Desert Star Travel Plaza didn't end with his retirement from trucking. In the months that followed, he received phone calls from other drivers who had experienced similar encounters at the facility. Each caller described identical experiences. The same waitress, the same cook, the same meal, the same mysterious parking lot activity. Some had been trapped in the pattern for weeks, others for years. Earl began documenting these reports, creating a database of drivers who had experienced what he came to term junction encounters at various locations across the American highway system. The Desert Star Travel Plaza was just one of dozens of facilities where drivers reported repetitive, loop-like experiences that seemed to exist outside normal time and space. The phenomenon wasn't limited to truck stops. Earl collected accounts of identical experiences at rest areas, way stations, fuel stops, and even sections of highway where drivers found themselves repeating the same stretch of road over and over again. The common elements were always present: repetitive scenarios, staff or situations that seemed to know the driver's routines in advance, and an inability to break free from the pattern until some form of understanding or acceptance was achieved. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a researcher studying highway psychology at Texas A&M University, became interested in Earl's database when word of his research reached academic circles. Dr. Walsh's analysis of the collected reports revealed patterns that suggested the encounters might be manifestations of what she termed temporal displacement anxiety, a psychological response to the repetitive nature of long-haul trucking that could, under specific conditions, create experiences that transcended normal perception of time and place. Long-haul truckers exist in a unique psychological space, Dr. Walsh explained in her preliminary research paper. They follow the same routes repeatedly, stop at the same locations, eat the same meals, and sleep in the same places week after week, year after year. This extreme repetition can create conditions where the mind begins to experience time differently, sometimes creating loops that feel more real than reality itself. However, Dr. Walsh's psychological framework struggled to explain the physical evidence that many drivers had collected. Photographs showing the same trucks in the same positions week after week, electronic logging device data showing impossible routes and timing, and the consistent testimony of witnesses who observed the affected driver's behavior during their encounters. Earl's research attracted the attention of Walter Morrison, a retired truck driver who had experienced his own junction encounter at a rest area in Kansas during the 1990s. Walter had been trapped in a loop where he repeatedly met the same hitchhiker, had the same conversation, and made the same decision to offer a ride, only to find himself back at the beginning of the encounter moments later. "I picked up the same guy 47 times, Walter told Earl during one of their phone conversations. Same clothes, same story, same destination. Each time I'd drive him about 10 miles down the road, he'd ask me to let him out at a specific crossroads, and then I'd find myself back at the rest area with him standing there with his thumb out. It took me 3 days to realize that the only way to break the loop was to not pick him up." Walter's experience had ended when he finally refused to offer the hitchhiker a ride, but not before he had lost 3 days of his life to the repetitive encounter. Like Earl, Walter had found that the rest area appeared completely normal to other drivers, and his electronic logs showed no record of the repeated trips that had dominated his experience. The similarities between Earl's and Walter's experiences suggested that junction encounters might be more common than either man had initially realized. Earl expanded his research to include historical accounts, finding references to repetitive highway experiences in trucker publications, CB radio logs, and even company dispatch records dating back to the 1960s. One particularly compelling historical case involved Dorothy Henderson, a female trucker who had worked the western routes during the 1970s. According to her own written account, discovered in her papers after her death in 2018, Dorothy had been trapped in a loop at a truck stop in Nevada for an entire week, serving the same meal to the same customer, while unable to remember how she had come to be working there or when her shift was supposed to end. Dorothy's account was remarkable because it provided the perspective of someone who had been part of the loop rather than trapped within it. According to her notes, she had been aware that she was repeating the same actions over and over again, but felt compelled to continue the pattern until the customer, a trucker she never identified, finally broke free from his own repetitive routine. Earl's database eventually contained over 200 documented cases of junction encounters, spanning 5 decades of American trucking history. The geographic distribution showed clusters around certain highways and regions, particularly in areas where major trucking routes intersected, or where drivers traditionally made regular stops. The most concentrated cluster of reports centered on Interstate 40 between Albuquerque and Oklahoma City, a corridor that included the Desert Star Travel Plaza and dozens of other locations where drivers had reported similar experiences. Other significant clusters appeared along Interstate 80 through Nebraska, Interstate 10 through Texas, and Interstate 70 through Kansas and Colorado. Earl's research revealed that junction encounters seemed to occur primarily during periods of transition in drivers' lives, career changes, family crises, health problems, or major life decisions. The repetitive experiences appeared to serve as a form of processing mechanism, forcing individuals to confront patterns in their own behavior or circumstances that they might otherwise ignore. The junctions aren't random, Earl concluded in his written summary of the research. They seem to appear when people need them, when someone is stuck in a life pattern that isn't serving them anymore. The repetitive experience forces you to examine what you're doing and why, and it doesn't let you go until you're ready to change. Earl's theory was supported by the consistent reports that junction encounters ended only when the affected individual achieved some form of insight or made a conscious decision to break their established patterns. Drivers who simply endured the repetitive experiences without reflection remained trapped for longer periods, while those who actively questioned their circumstances typically found release more quickly. The psychological impact of junction encounters varied significantly among affected drivers. Some, like Earl, found the experience ultimately liberating, using it as motivation to make positive changes in their lives. Others struggled with lasting anxiety and uncertainty about the reliability of their own perceptions. A few drivers reported ongoing difficulties distinguishing between normal experiences and potential loop situations, leading to chronic hypervigilance and paranoia. Margaret Henderson, a counselor specializing in transportation worker mental health, began working with junction encounter survivors in 2021 after Earl referred several drivers to her practice. Her clinical observations confirmed that the experiences, regardless of their ultimate nature or cause, had profound psychological effects that required specialized treatment approaches. These drivers have experienced something that challenges their fundamental understanding of reality, Margaret explained. Whether the encounters are psychological, supernatural, or something else entirely, the impact on their mental health is very real and often very serious. Traditional therapy approaches don't always address the unique aspects of these experiences. Margaret developed treatment protocols specifically designed for junction encounter survivors, focusing on helping them integrate their experiences into their overall life narrative without becoming trapped by fear or uncertainty. Her approach emphasized the practical coping skills drivers needed to continue their careers while managing the psychological aftermath of encounters that defied conventional explanation. Earl's research and Margaret's therapeutic work attracted the attention of the American Trucking Association, which quietly began collecting its own data on unusual experiences reported by member drivers. While the organization stopped short of officially acknowledging the reality of junction encounters, they implemented new support services for drivers experiencing psychological distress related to highway anomalies. The ATA's involvement brought additional resources to the study of junction encounters, but also increased pressure to find conventional explanations for the reported phenomena. Some researchers proposed that the experiences might be related to electromagnetic fields generated by highway infrastructure, while others suggested connections to low-frequency sound waves produced by heavy truck traffic. However, none of the proposed scientific explanations adequately accounted for the consistent details reported across multiple encounters, the identical dialogues, the precise timing of events, the appearance and disappearance of vehicles and facilities, and the inability of witnesses to observe the same phenomena experienced by the affected drivers. Dr. Robert Chen, a physicist studying consciousness and perception at Stanford University, became involved in the research after reviewing Earl's database and Margaret's clinical reports. Dr. Chen's analysis focused on the possibility that junction encounters might represent interactions with what he termed temporal echoes, repetitive patterns in space-time that could become accessible to human consciousness under specific conditions. The highway system creates a unique environment where the same routes are traveled by the same people following the same schedules for years or decades, Dr. Chen explained in his theoretical framework. This repetition might create persistent patterns in the quantum field that can, under certain circumstances, become manifest as seemingly physical experiences. Dr. Chen's quantum mechanical approach to junction encounters provided a theoretical foundation that could potentially reconcile the subjective reality of the experiences with their apparent violation of conventional physics. However, his theories remained highly speculative and faced significant skepticism from mainstream scientific communities. Earl continued his research through 2021 and 2022, but gradually shifted his focus from collecting new cases to providing support for affected drivers and their families. His ranch outside Amarillo became an informal gathering place for junction encounter survivors, offering a space where they could discuss their experiences without fear of ridicule or disbelief. The support network that developed around Earl's research created lasting friendships among drivers who had experienced similar encounters. Many found that connecting with others who had undergone comparable experiences helped them process the psychological impact and develop coping strategies for dealing with ongoing effects. Walter Morrison became Earl's closest collaborator in the research, eventually moving to Texas to help establish a more formal support organization for junction encounter survivors. Together, they created a nonprofit foundation dedicated to documenting unusual highway experiences and providing resources for affected drivers and their families. The foundation's work attracted international attention when similar phenomena were reported by truck drivers in Canada, Australia, and several European countries. The global scope of junction encounters suggested that the phenomenon might be related to fundamental aspects of consciousness, time, and repetitive human behavior, rather than specific geographic or cultural factors. Earl's personal recovery from his Desert Star experience was gradual but complete. The cattle ranch provided him with a sense of stability and routine that was grounding rather than trapping, and his marriage to Margaret grew stronger as they worked together to understand and integrate his experience into their shared life. However, Earl never completely lost his connection to the highway system and the mysteries it contained. He continued to feel a subtle pull whenever he drove past truck stops and rest areas, as if the junctions were calling to him with the promise of answers to questions he hadn't yet learned to ask. In late 2022, Earl received a phone call from a young driver named Harold, who had become trapped in a junction encounter at a truck stop in Montana. Harold had been repeating the same conversation with the same cashier for 2 weeks, unable to break free from the pattern despite his growing awareness of its repetitive nature. Earl drove to Montana to provide direct assistance to Harold, marking his first return to the highway system since his retirement. The intervention was successful. Earl's presence and guidance helped Harold recognize the choices that would break his loop. But the experience reawakened Earl's awareness of how many drivers might be struggling with similar encounters without support or understanding. "The junctions are still out there," Earl told Margaret after returning from Montana. "Maybe more active than ever. Drivers are under more stress, facing more uncertainty, and the highway system is busier and more demanding than it's ever been. People need to know that if this happens to them, they're not going crazy, and they're not alone." Earl's work with Harold led to increased activity by the Support Foundation, with more drivers reaching out for help and more families seeking resources to understand what their loved ones had experienced. The foundation established a 24-hour hotline for drivers experiencing anomalous highway encounters, staffed by volunteers who had survived their own junction experiences. The hotline received hundreds of calls during its first year of operation, confirming Earl's suspicion that junction encounters were far more common than documented cases suggested. Many callers reported experiences that had occurred years or decades earlier, but had never been discussed due to fear of professional or personal consequences. Dr. Sarah Kim, a researcher studying transportation psychology at the University of Michigan, began collaborating with the Foundation in 2023 to develop comprehensive data on the scope and characteristics of junction encounters. Her preliminary analysis suggested that as many as 3% of long-haul truck drivers might experience some form of temporal loop or repetitive anomaly during their careers. These experiences appear to be a natural, if rare, consequence of the unique psychological and physical environment created by modern highway transportation, Dr. Kim explained in her initial findings. The combination of repetitive routes, isolated decision-making, and extreme time pressure may create conditions where consciousness can become temporarily unstuck from normal temporal progression. Earl's collaboration with Dr. Kim's research team provided scientific credibility to the Foundation's work, while maintaining focus on the practical support needs of affected drivers. The combination of academic research and survivor support created a comprehensive approach to understanding and addressing junction encounters that neither could achieve independently. As of 2024, Earl's database contains over 500 documented cases of junction encounters across North America, with additional reports coming from drivers in other countries. The geographic and temporal distribution of these cases continues to reveal patterns that suggest junction encounters are not random events, but may be connected to specific conditions in both the physical highway environment and the psychological state of individual drivers. The Desert Star Travel Plaza remains closed and partially demolished, exactly as the corporate photographs had shown during Earl's encounters. However, Earl occasionally receives reports from drivers who claim to have stopped there recently, describing experiences identical to his own. These reports suggest that the junction itself may persist independently of the physical facility that originally contained it. Earl's transformation from a trapped trucker to a researcher and advocate represents one of the most positive outcomes documented among junction encounter survivors. His ability to find meaning and purpose in his experience has provided a model for other survivors seeking to integrate their encounters into productive and fulfilling lives. Margaret Earl, now in her early 60s, continues to operate his cattle ranch while maintaining active involvement in the Foundation's work. His daily routines are deliberately varied and flexible, avoiding the rigid patterns that might create vulnerability to future junction encounters. However, he acknowledges that his experience at the Desert Star Travel Plaza fundamentally changed his understanding of time, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. "I don't claim to understand what happened to me at that truck stop," Earl reflects. "I don't know if it was psychological, supernatural, or something else entirely. But I know it changed my life in ways that were ultimately positive, even though the experience itself was terrifying and confusing. What I've learned from my research is that these encounters serve a purpose, even if we don't understand what that purpose is. They force people to examine their lives, their choices, and their patterns in ways they might never do otherwise. Sometimes being trapped in a loop is exactly what someone needs to break free from a bigger trap they didn't even recognize. Earl's story continues to evolve as new cases are documented and additional research reveals more about the nature and function of junction encounters. His experience at the Desert Star Travel Plaza, while unique in its specific details, represents a phenomenon that may be far more common and significant than the transportation industry has previously recognized. For drivers who continue to traverse America's highways, Earl's research provides both warning and reassurance. Warning that the repetitive nature of long-haul trucking can create conditions where reality itself becomes unstable, and reassurance that such experiences, however terrifying, can lead to positive transformation when approached with understanding and support. The legacy of Earl's months trapped in the Desert Star's temporal loop extends beyond his personal recovery to encompass a growing understanding of consciousness, time, and the hidden complexities of human experience. His willingness to document and share his encounter has created a foundation for helping others navigate similar experiences while contributing to broader questions about the nature of reality itself. As America's highways continue to carry millions of drivers through their daily routines, the phenomenon Earl experienced serves as a reminder that familiarity and routine, while necessary for efficient transportation, may also create conditions where the boundaries between expected reality and something far more mysterious can become permeable. Whether junction encounters represent glitches in perception, gaps in our understanding of physics, or doorways to entirely different dimensions of experience, they continue to occur with sufficient frequency to suggest that they are not anomalies, but rather natural, if rare, aspects of consciousness operating within the unique environment created by modern transportation systems. Earl's story stands as a testament to the resilience of human consciousness and the possibility that even the most disorienting and frightening experiences can ultimately lead to greater understanding, personal growth, and service to others facing similar challenges. In the end, his months trapped in the Desert Star's loop became the foundation for a life dedicated to helping others navigate the mysterious territories that exist in the spaces between the familiar and the unknown. Harold Peterson never paid much attention to CB radio until the voices started calling his name. The 44-year-old trucker from Billings, Montana, had been hauling freight across the northern plains for 12 years, preferring the solitude of long-distance runs that kept him away from home for weeks at a time. Unlike many drivers who treated their CB radios as lifelines to companionship and information, Harold used his primarily for weather reports and mandatory DOT communications. The constant chatter that filled most truckers' cabs was, to Harold, nothing more than distraction from the meditative rhythm of highway driving. This preference for silence made what happened during the winter of 2021 all the more disturbing. Harold's transformation from a driver who barely used his radio to someone who became obsessed with mysterious transmissions began on December 14th, during what should have been a routine haul from Fargo to Spokane. The cargo was unremarkable: agricultural equipment parts bound for wheat farms in eastern Washington, and the weather, while cold, was clear enough for safe winter driving across the northern tier of states. Harold departed the North Dakota Agricultural Supply Depot at 3:47 p.m., his red Kenworth T800 pulling a standard dry van loaded with 41,000 pounds of cultivator components and irrigation hardware. His planned route would take him west on Interstate 94 through North Dakota, then northwest on Highway 2 through Montana before connecting to Interstate 90 for the final approach to Spokane. The journey typically required 14 hours of driving time spread across 2 days, with a mandatory rest stop somewhere in central Montana. The early portion of the trip proceeded exactly as Harold expected. Traffic was light due to the season and hour, consisting mainly of other commercial vehicles and the occasional passenger car brave enough to tackle the northern plains in December. Harold maintained his usual pace of 67 miles per hour, monitoring his fuel consumption and cargo temperature while listening to weather reports on his factory-installed radio. His CB remained tuned to channel 19, but turned down low enough that he could ignore the sporadic conversations between other drivers. As darkness fell around 5:30 p.m., Harold crossed from North Dakota into Montana, following the familiar ribbon of asphalt that cut through endless expanses of snow-covered grassland. The landscape was achingly beautiful in its emptiness, rolling hills that stretched to every horizon, broken only by occasional grain elevators and the scattered lights of isolated farmsteads. This was the kind of driving Harold cherished: long, straight roads with minimal traffic, allowing him to settle into the almost hypnotic state that made hundreds of miles pass unnoticed. It was approximately 7:15 p.m., somewhere between Malta and Glasgow along Highway 2, when Harold first noticed the unusual radio activity. He had stopped at a small truck stop for fuel and a quick dinner, and while eating a sandwich in his cab, he had turned up his CB radio to monitor road conditions ahead. Instead of the typical weather discussions and traffic reports, however, Harold heard something that made him pause mid-bite. A voice was reading what sounded like a list of names, locations, and numbers in a calm, professional tone that reminded Harold of air traffic controllers or emergency dispatchers. The transmission was clear and strong, suggesting a nearby source, but the content made no immediate sense. The voice read, "Peterson, Harold J., northbound Highway 2, mile marker 237, ETA Glasgow 1947 hours. Cargo secure, driver condition normal. Proceed to next checkpoint." Harold nearly choked on his sandwich. The voice had just recited his full name, his exact location, his destination, and his estimated arrival time with precision that seemed impossible for a random radio operator to possess. Harold checked his watch. 7:17 p.m., which would be 1917 hours in military time. Glasgow was approximately 30 miles ahead, and at his current pace, he would indeed arrive around 7:47 p.m., or 1947 hours. Harold grabbed his microphone and keyed the transmission button. "Breaker 19, this is Harold Peterson. Someone just called out my name and location on this frequency. Who's running traffic control out here?" The response came immediately, but not from the mysterious voice that had mentioned his name. Instead, a familiar-sounding trucker replied, "Negative on any traffic control, Harold. This is Jake Morrison, about 10 miles behind you. Haven't heard anything unusual on the radio tonight. You feeling all right up there?" Harold knew Jake Morrison by reputation, a veteran driver who worked the same northern routes Harold traveled. Jake's response was both reassuring and puzzling. If Jake was only 10 miles behind him and monitoring the same frequency, how had he missed the transmission that had mentioned Harold by name? "Jake, you didn't hear someone reading off driver names and locations about 2 minutes ago? Male voice, very professional sounding?" "Negative, Harold. Been monitoring 19 for the past hour. Only traffic has been a couple drivers discussing road conditions around Haver. Maybe you picked up some bleed over from another frequency?" CB radios occasionally received transmissions from other services, airport control towers, emergency dispatchers, or marine radio operators, when atmospheric conditions created unusual signal propagation. Harold accepted Jake's explanation and continued his journey, but he kept his radio volume turned up and his attention focused on any additional unusual transmissions. For the next hour, Harold heard only normal CB traffic, drivers discussing fuel prices, road conditions, and the locations of highway patrol units. He began to convince himself that Jake's explanation was correct, and that he had simply overheard an unrelated radio communication that had coincidentally mentioned his name. Harold Peterson was a common enough name that the odds of such a coincidence, while unlikely, weren't impossible. This rationalization collapsed at 8:23 p.m. when the same voice returned to the frequency. This time the transmission was even more detailed and disturbing. "Peterson, Harold J., northbound Highway 2, mile marker 267, Cargo temperature stable at 34 degrees Fahrenheit, tire pressure optimal, fuel remaining 847 miles range. Driver showing elevated stress indicators. Recommend proceeding to designated rest area for psychological evaluation. Harold's blood ran cold. The voice had not only tracked his continued progress along the highway, but had somehow obtained information about his truck's operational status that should have been impossible for an outside observer to know. His cargo wasn't temperature sensitive, and his trailer wasn't equipped with external temperature monitoring. His tire pressure monitoring system was internal to his truck's computer and not connected to any external communication device. Most unsettling was the reference to elevated stress indicators and psychological evaluation. Harold immediately keyed his microphone. "Breaker 1 to 9, this is Harold Peterson. I'm hearing someone monitoring my truck's systems and calling out detailed information about my cargo and location. Anyone else hearing these transmissions?" The response came from multiple drivers, none of whom had heard anything unusual. Jake Morrison confirmed he was still monitoring the frequency and had heard only Harold's own transmissions. Two other drivers, one eastbound and one about 50 miles ahead, also reported normal radio traffic with no mention of detailed truck monitoring. Harold began to suspect that he was receiving transmissions that other drivers couldn't hear, possibly due to some malfunction in his radio equipment or unusual atmospheric conditions affecting only his specific location. He decided to continue monitoring the frequency while documenting everything he heard, in case the information might be useful for troubleshooting his radio system later. The mysterious transmissions continued throughout the evening, occurring approximately every 30 to 40 minutes, with the same professional, emotionless delivery. Each transmission included updated information about Harold's location, truck status, and increasingly personal observations about his behavior and psychological condition. At 9:47 p.m., Peterson, Harold J., approaching Glasgow city limits, speed 64 mph, following distance adequate. Driver exhibiting increased alertness and frequent mirror checking. Recommend continued monitoring. At 10:31 p.m., Peterson, Harold J., departed Glasgow Flying J, fuel topped off, meal skipped, departure time ahead of schedule. Driver showing signs of acute anxiety. Advise maintaining current surveillance protocol. At 11:15 p.m., Peterson, Harold J., mile marker 312, entering remote sector, cellular coverage intermittent. Driver attempting to contact family, unsuccessful. Isolation factors increasing psychological pressure as predicted. The accuracy of these observations was terrifying. Harold had indeed skipped his usual dinner stop in Glasgow, concerned about the strange radio transmissions and eager to reach a more populated area. He had tried calling his wife Linda from the truck stop, but had been unable to get a cellular signal. The voice on the radio was somehow monitoring not just his truck's location and mechanical systems, but his personal behavior and decision-making. Harold's training as a commercial driver included protocols for dealing with various emergency situations, but nothing had prepared him for the possibility that his movements were being tracked and broadcast by an unknown source. He considered contacting law enforcement, but realized that his situation would be difficult to explain, especially since no other drivers could hear the transmissions he was reporting. As Harold continued west through the empty Montana landscape, the transmissions became more frequent and more invasive. The voice began providing information that went beyond external observation to include details that suggested access to Harold's personal records, employment history, and private life. At 12:03 a.m., Peterson, Harold J., 12 years commercial driving experience, clean DOT record, current employment Mountain West Transport, vehicle maintenance records excellent, personal credit rating stable. Wife Linda concerned about extended absence, last contact 72 hours ago. At 12:47 a.m., Peterson, Harold J., approaching Chinook, Montana, population 1,203. Driver's father worked grain elevator in this location 1967 to 1982. Recommend psychological evaluation to assess impact of family history on current stress response. Harold had never mentioned his father's employment history to his current employer or to anyone in the trucking industry. His father had indeed operated a grain elevator in Chinook during the years the voice specified, but that information was part of Harold's private family history, not something that would appear in any commercial driving records or employment files. The realization that the voice had access to such personal information transformed Harold's unease into active fear. Someone or some organization was conducting comprehensive surveillance of his life and broadcasting the results over CB radio frequencies that apparently only he could hear. The purpose of this surveillance was unclear, but the reference to psychological evaluation suggested that Harold himself was the subject of some form of study or assessment. Harold decided to deviate from his planned route to test whether the voice would continue tracking him. Instead of continuing west on Highway 2 toward Havre, he turned south on Highway 87 toward Great Falls. This detour would add approximately 2 hours to his journey and require him to call his dispatcher to report a schedule change. But Harold needed to determine whether he could escape whatever surveillance system was monitoring his movements. The response was immediate. Peterson, Harold J., unauthorized route deviation detected, turning south on Highway 87 at 01:27 hours. This deviation was not anticipated in behavioral modeling. Recommend immediate intervention to restore planned trajectory. Harold floored his accelerator, pushing his truck to its maximum safe speed on the empty highway. If someone was physically following him, he might be able to outdistance them or force them to reveal themselves. If the surveillance was being conducted through electronic means, speed wouldn't help, but at least he would be taking some form of action rather than passively accepting whatever was being done to him. For 20 minutes, Harold drove at 75 miles per hour through the darkness of central Montana, his truck's engine straining to maintain the pace with a full load. The landscape flashed past his headlights. Empty grassland, occasional ranch gates, and the distant glow of isolated farmsteads. The CB radio remained silent, except for his own labored breathing and the sound of his truck's mechanical systems working at their limits. Then, at 1:51 a.m., the voice returned with a tone that seemed less professional and more urgent. Peterson, Harold J. Excessive speed detected. 74 mph in 65 mph zone. Driver showing signs of panic response. This behavior pattern suggests psychological breakdown may be imminent. Recommend immediate intercept and containment. The word intercept sent a chill through Harold's entire body. Whatever organization was conducting this surveillance was apparently prepared to take physical action to control his movements. Harold immediately reduced his speed to the legal limit and began scanning the road ahead and behind for any signs of approaching vehicles. The Montana highway was empty except for his truck, but Harold realized that isolation could work against him as easily as it could work in his favor. If someone wanted to intercept him on this remote stretch of road, there would be no witnesses and no immediate help available. Harold's cell phone showed no signal, and his truck's satellite communication system was designed for routine dispatch communications rather than emergency situations. Harold decided to return to Highway 2 and continue toward his original destination, hoping that maintaining his planned route might reduce the likelihood of the intercept that the voice had recommended. However, as he approached the intersection where Highway 87 rejoined Highway 2, Harold noticed headlights in his mirrors, the first vehicle he had seen in over an hour. The approaching vehicle was traveling significantly faster than the speed limit, closing the distance between itself and Harold's truck with deliberate purpose. Harold increased his speed slightly, but the pursuing vehicle matched his acceleration, maintaining a consistent following distance of approximately 200 yards. Unlike normal highway traffic, which would either pass or establish a comfortable following distance, this vehicle seemed content to simply shadow Harold's movements. At 2:23 a.m., the voice returned with an update that confirmed Harold's worst fears. Peterson, Harold J., Intercept vehicle deployed. Contact established. Driver awareness of surveillance confirmed. Proceeding to Phase 2 protocols. Recommend psychological evaluation facility in Great Falls for immediate assessment. Harold could see the pursuing vehicle clearly in his mirrors now. A dark SUV with no visible law enforcement markings, but equipped with unusually bright headlights and what appeared to be additional antennas or communication equipment. The vehicle maintained its position behind Harold's truck with the same precision that had characterized the radio transmissions, suggesting that the physical surveillance was being conducted by the same organization responsible for the voice communications. Harold's options were limited. He could attempt to outrun the pursuing vehicle, but his loaded truck was no match for an SUV on the open highway. He could stop and confront whoever was following him, but that would leave him vulnerable and isolated on a deserted road. He could continue to his destination and hope that the surveillance would end when he reached a populated area, but the voice had already mentioned specific facilities where Harold might be taken for evaluation. Harold chose a fourth option. He would drive to the nearest law enforcement facility and report what was happening to him. According to his GPS system, the Montana Highway Patrol had a station in Havre, approximately 60 miles ahead on his original route. If he could reach that facility, he would be able to get help from authorities who were equipped to deal with whatever organization was conducting the surveillance. The pursuing SUV seemed to anticipate Harold's decision. As he maintained his course toward Havre, the vehicle's following distance gradually decreased, and Harold noticed that additional vehicles had appeared on the highway ahead of him. What had been an empty road was now populated with several sets of headlights, all traveling at speeds that would intersect with Harold's truck as he approached the outskirts of Havre. At 2:47 a.m., the voice provided a final update. Peterson, Harold J., approaching containment perimeter. Multiple intercept vehicles in position. Driver will be directed to Facility 7 for comprehensive evaluation. This transmission concludes monitoring phase. Thank you for your cooperation. Harold had never agreed to cooperate with anything, but the voice's tone suggested that his cooperation was no longer optional. The vehicles ahead of him had arranged themselves in a formation that would effectively box in his truck, while the SUV behind him had closed to within 50 yards. Harold realized that he was being herded toward a specific location by an organization that had demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of his personal information and truck operations. As Harold approached the perimeter of vehicles, he noticed that their license plates were either obscured or showed combinations that didn't correspond to any state's standard format. The vehicles themselves appeared to be standard civilian models, SUVs, pickup trucks, and sedans, but all were equipped with additional lighting and communication equipment that suggested official or quasi-official purpose. The lead vehicle in the formation ahead of Harold activated what appeared to be emergency flashers and began signaling for him to pull over. Harold had no choice but to comply, as attempting to drive through the roadblock would likely result in a collision that could damage his cargo or injure innocent drivers who might not be part of whatever organization was conducting the surveillance. Harold pulled his truck to the shoulder of Highway 2 at mile marker 341, approximately 20 miles east of Havre. The pursuing vehicles arranged themselves around his truck in a loose circle, their occupants remaining inside their vehicles but clearly coordinating their positions through radio communication. Harold could see figures moving inside the vehicles, but the tinted windows and bright exterior lighting made it impossible to identify specific individuals or determine their official status. At 3:15 a.m., a figure emerged from the lead SUV and approached Harold's truck. The individual was wearing what appeared to be a standard business suit with a heavy winter coat, and carried a briefcase and a handheld radio. Despite the professional appearance, something about the person's movement and posture suggested military or law enforcement training. The figure knocked on Harold's driver's side window and gestured for him to roll it down. Harold complied. though he kept his engine running and his truck in gear in case he needed to attempt an escape. "Mr. Peterson," the figure said in a voice Harold immediately recognized as the same one that had been providing the radio transmissions throughout the evening. "Thank you for stopping. I'm Agent Richardson with the Department of Transportation's Special Investigations Unit. We need to discuss some irregularities we've observed in your driving patterns and cargo documentation." Harold had never heard of a Special Investigations Unit within the Department of Transportation, and the agent's explanation didn't account for the detailed personal information that had been broadcast over the radio or the comprehensive surveillance that had tracked his every movement for hours. "I don't understand what this is about," Harold replied. "My cargo is legal, my logbooks are current, and I haven't violated any traffic laws. Why have you been monitoring my radio communications and tracking my truck?" Agent Richardson smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Peterson, we've been monitoring communications from your truck because we've received reports of unauthorized transmissions from your vehicle. Our investigation suggests that your CB radio may have been modified to broadcast on frequencies reserved for government use." Harold was stunned by this accusation. His CB radio was a standard factory unit that had never been modified or tampered with in any way. Moreover, he had been receiving the mysterious transmissions, not broadcasting them. The agent's explanation was a complete reversal of what had actually occurred. "That's not what happened," Harold protested. "Someone has been broadcasting information about my truck and my personal life over CB frequencies. I've been trying to figure out who was doing it and why. I never transmitted anything except normal driver communications." Agent Richardson opened his briefcase and removed a small electronic device that looked like a handheld radio scanner. "Mr. Peterson, this equipment has been monitoring electromagnetic emissions from your truck for the past 6 hours. We have recorded multiple unauthorized transmissions originating from your vehicle, including detailed information about other drivers, cargo movements, and commercial operations." The agent activated the device, and Harold heard his own voice saying things he had never said. Detailed descriptions of other trucks he had passed, information about cargo loads and delivery schedules, and even personal observations about other drivers' behavior and appearance. The recordings were definitely his voice, but the words were completely unfamiliar. Harold felt a growing sense of disorientation and confusion. Either the recordings were somehow fabricated, or his truck was indeed transmitting information without his knowledge or consent. Both possibilities were deeply troubling, but the latter suggested that Harold himself might be the source of the surveillance activity that had terrorized him throughout the evening. "I don't understand," Harold said. "I never said any of those things. How could my truck be transmitting information I never provided?" Agent Richardson's expression became more sympathetic. "Mr. Peterson, we believe your truck may have been equipped with experimental monitoring equipment without your knowledge. This equipment appears to be designed to collect and transmit information about commercial vehicle operations, but it may also be affecting your perception and memory." The agent gestured toward the other vehicles surrounding Harold's truck. "We're part of a joint task force investigating unauthorized surveillance equipment that has been installed on commercial vehicles throughout the Northern Plains region. You're not in trouble, but we need your cooperation to determine what equipment has been installed and how it's affecting drivers." Harold's relief at learning he wasn't being accused of wrongdoing was tempered by the disturbing implications of the agent's explanation. If his truck had been equipped with surveillance equipment, when had it been installed? Who had done it? And most importantly, what else might the equipment be doing besides transmitting information? "What kind of effects might this equipment have on drivers?" Harold asked. Agent Richardson consulted a clipboard before responding. "The equipment appears to be designed to monitor not just vehicle operations, but also driver behavior, stress levels, and decision-making patterns. Some drivers have reported memory gaps, unusual fatigue, and difficulty distinguishing between their own thoughts and external communications." Harold realized that he had indeed experienced some of these symptoms during his evening drive. His decision-making had felt somehow external, as if he were following suggestions rather than making independent choices. His stress levels had been unusually high even before the radio transmissions began, and he had experienced moments of disorientation that he had attributed to fatigue. "How many drivers have been affected by this equipment?" Harold asked. "We've identified approximately 40 commercial vehicles in the Northern Plains region that appear to be equipped with similar systems," Agent Richardson replied. "The equipment seems to be targeting specific routes and specific types of cargo, though we haven't yet determined the selection criteria." Harold thought about his cargo of agricultural equipment parts. The load wasn't particularly valuable or sensitive, but it was destined for farms in eastern Washington, an area that supplied food products to much of the Pacific Northwest. Perhaps the surveillance was related to food security or agricultural monitoring rather than general commercial intelligence. Agent Richardson seemed to read Harold's thoughts. "Mr. Peterson, we'd like to inspect your truck and remove any unauthorized equipment we find. This will require us to unload your cargo and examine every system in your vehicle. The process will take several hours, but we can arrange for you to continue your delivery on schedule once we've completed our investigation." Harold agreed to the inspection, partly because he wanted to understand what had been done to his truck, and partly because he didn't feel he had much choice given the circumstances. Agent Richardson directed him to follow the lead vehicle to what he described as a secure facility, where the inspection could be conducted properly. The convoy of vehicles led Harold approximately 15 miles off the main highway to what appeared to be an abandoned truck stop. The facility was clearly not in operation. The fuel pumps were covered with tarps, the building windows were boarded up, and weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot. However, the site was equipped with powerful portable lighting systems and several large trucks that appeared to contain specialized equipment. As Harold parked his truck in the designated area, he noticed that the facility was larger and more complex than it had appeared from the highway. Behind the main building, partially concealed by a ridge, were several additional structures that looked like warehouses or maintenance facilities. The entire complex was surrounded by a fence topped with barbed wire, though Harold hadn't noticed the security measures until he was already inside the perimeter. Agent Richardson directed Harold to a small office trailer where he was asked to complete paperwork related to the inspection and removal of unauthorized equipment. The forms were extensive and detailed, requiring information about Harold's employment history, cargo records, and even his personal travel patterns outside of commercial driving. While Harold completed the paperwork, he could see through the trailer's window that a team of technicians was already working on his truck. The team appeared to be highly trained and well-equipped, using sophisticated electronic equipment to scan Harold's vehicle and identify the locations of any unauthorized devices. After 2 hours, Agent Richardson returned to the trailer with a briefcase full of electronic components that had apparently been removed from Harold's truck. The devices were small and sophisticated, designed to be completely invisible during normal vehicle operations. Some had been installed in locations that would have required disassembly of major truck components, suggesting that the installation had been performed by highly skilled technicians with access to detailed vehicle specifications. "Mr. Peterson," Agent Richardson said, "we've removed 17 different monitoring devices from your truck. These devices were collecting and transmitting information about your location, cargo, driving patterns, and even your physiological responses to stress. The most sophisticated device was integrated with your CB radio system and was capable of creating synthetic voice transmissions that mimicked external communications." Harold was amazed by the complexity and extent of the surveillance equipment. "How long have these devices been on my truck, and who installed them?" "Based on the installation techniques and component dating, we believe the equipment was installed approximately 6 months ago," Agent Richardson replied. "The installation was performed by someone with extensive knowledge of commercial vehicle systems and access to your truck during routine maintenance or inspection." Harold tried to remember when his truck had been serviced during the past 6 months. He used several different maintenance facilities depending on his location and schedule, and any of them could have provided access for unauthorized installation of surveillance equipment. "Do you know who's responsible for this surveillance?" Harold asked. Agent Richardson's expression became more guarded. "We're still investigating the source of the equipment and the organization behind the surveillance program. What we can tell you is that this appears to be a large-scale operation targeting commercial vehicles throughout the northern United States. The purpose seems to be intelligence gathering related to cargo movements, driver behavior, and transportation infrastructure." Harold was disturbed by the implications of a large-scale surveillance operation targeting truck drivers. The information collected by such a program could be used for economic espionage, transportation disruption, or even national security threats related to the movement of goods and materials. "Is this connected to foreign intelligence services?" Harold asked. "We can't discuss the details of our investigation," Agent Richardson replied, "but we want you to know that you've been very helpful in our efforts to understand and counter this surveillance program. The information we've gathered from your truck will help us protect other drivers who may be unknowingly carrying similar equipment." Harold was provided with documentation certifying that his truck had been inspected and cleared of unauthorized equipment. He was also given contact information for reporting any unusual radio communications or other suspicious activities during future trips. Agent Richardson assured him that the removal of the surveillance equipment would not affect his truck's normal operations, and that he should not experience any further anomalous radio transmissions. Harold departed the facility at 7:30 a.m., continuing his journey toward Spokane with his cargo intact and his truck apparently free of surveillance equipment. However, the experience had fundamentally changed his relationship with long-distance trucking and his understanding of the potential vulnerabilities associated with commercial transportation. The remainder of Harold's trip proceeded normally, with no unusual radio transmissions or other evidence of surveillance. He completed his delivery on schedule and returned to Billings without incident. However, Harold found himself constantly monitoring his CB radio for any signs of anomalous communications and frequently checking his truck for evidence of new surveillance equipment. In the weeks following his encounter with Agent Richardson's team, Harold researched the Department of Transportation's organizational structure and was unable to find any reference to a special investigations unit. His inquiries to DOT offices in Washington, D.C. and regional centers were either unanswered or resulted in responses stating that no such unit existed within the department. Harold also attempted to locate the facility where his truck had been inspected, but when he returned to the location several weeks later, he found only an empty lot with no evidence that any buildings or equipment had ever been present. The site showed signs of recent earth-moving activity, as if the entire complex had been removed and the area restored to its original condition. These discoveries raised troubling questions about the identity of Agent Richardson and his team. If they weren't actually affiliated with the Department of Transportation, who were they? And if the surveillance equipment had been real, who had removed it and why? Harold began documenting his experience and reaching out to other drivers to determine whether similar incidents had occurred in the region. Through trucking forums and CB radio networks, he discovered that at least 12 other drivers had reported unusual radio transmissions, unauthorized vehicle inspections, and encounters with individuals claiming to represent various government agencies. The reports followed a consistent pattern. Drivers would experience mysterious radio transmissions that included detailed personal information, followed by interception by vehicles with government-style markings, and finally, inspection and modification of their trucks by teams claiming to be investigating surveillance equipment. Harold's research revealed that all of the affected drivers worked routes through the northern plains states and carried cargo related to agriculture, energy, or defense industries. The geographic and cargo patterns suggested that the surveillance operation, whatever its true purpose, was targeting specific economic sectors and transportation corridors. Dr. Michael Torres, a researcher studying transportation security at Montana State University, became interested in Harold's case when word of his research reached academic circles. Dr. Torres had been investigating reports of unusual incidents involving commercial vehicles and had identified similar patterns in other parts of the country. What you've described fits a larger pattern of incidents involving sophisticated surveillance of commercial transportation, Dr. Torres explained during a phone conversation with Harold. We've documented similar cases in Texas, Colorado, and the Pacific Northwest. The common elements are always the same: detailed monitoring of driver behavior, interception by unmarked vehicles, and claims about unauthorized equipment that may or may not actually exist. Dr. Torres's research suggested that the surveillance operation might be part of a larger intelligence-gathering effort targeting America's transportation infrastructure. The information collected could be used to map cargo flows, identify vulnerabilities in supply chains, or develop capabilities for disrupting commercial transportation during times of conflict or crisis. The most troubling aspect of these cases, Dr. Torres noted, is the sophisticated understanding of driver psychology and behavior demonstrated by whoever is conducting the surveillance. The radio transmissions you described were clearly designed to create specific emotional responses and decision-making patterns. Someone has invested considerable resources in understanding how to manipulate truck driver behavior through psychological pressure. Harold's experience had indeed involved sophisticated psychological manipulation. The radio transmissions had gradually escalated his stress levels while providing information that made him feel powerless and monitored. His decision to deviate from his planned route and his subsequent cooperation with Agent Richardson's team had been responses to psychological pressure rather than rational analysis of his situation. Dr. Torres arranged for Harold to undergo psychological evaluation to assess the lasting effects of his experience. The evaluation revealed that Harold had developed symptoms consistent with surveillance-related anxiety, including hypervigilance, persistent worry about being monitored, and difficulty trusting his own perceptions and memories. Experiences like yours can have long-lasting psychological effects, the evaluating psychologist explained. The combination of technological surveillance and psychological manipulation creates a sense of powerlessness and uncertainty that can affect every aspect of your life, not just your professional driving. Harold began participating in Dr. Torres's research as both a subject and a collaborator, helping to document and analyze similar cases throughout the Northern Plains region. This work provided Harold with a sense of purpose and control that helped him cope with the psychological aftermath of his experience. However, Harold's involvement in the research also led to additional unusual incidents. On several occasions, he noticed vehicles following him during routine trips around Billings. His home phone received calls from individuals claiming to represent various government agencies and asking questions about his research activities. His mail delivery became irregular, with some correspondence apparently never reaching him and other items arriving damaged or obviously opened. These continued incidents suggested that Harold's cooperation with Dr. Torres's research had attracted additional attention from whatever organization had originally conducted the surveillance of his truck. The harassment was subtle but persistent, designed to discourage his continued involvement in documenting and analyzing surveillance incidents. Harold's wife, Linda, became increasingly concerned about the impact of these incidents on their family's safety and privacy. The couple began taking precautions typically associated with witness protection, varying their daily routines, avoiding predictable patterns, and maintaining heightened awareness of their surroundings. "I don't understand why this is still happening," Linda told Harold during one of their discussions about the ongoing harassment. "You cooperated with their investigation, whatever it was. Why can't they just leave us alone?" Harold didn't have a satisfactory answer to his wife's question. His cooperation with Agent Richardson's team should have ended his involvement in whatever surveillance operation had targeted his truck. The continued attention suggested that his value to the operation extended beyond simply carrying monitoring equipment, possibly into his role as a witness to the surveillance program's methods and capabilities. Dr. Torres's research eventually attracted the attention of federal law enforcement agencies, leading to an FBI investigation into the reported surveillance incidents. However, the investigation quickly encountered obstacles. The facilities where truck inspections had allegedly occurred showed no evidence of recent activity. The individuals who had claimed to represent government agencies could not be identified through official records, and the surveillance equipment that drivers reported having removed from their trucks had left no trace of its existence. FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen, who led the investigation, described the case as one of the most sophisticated disinformation operations we've encountered. According to Agent Chen, the evidence suggested that the entire surveillance program might have been designed not to collect intelligence, but to create the impression of intelligence collection for psychological or strategic purposes. The goal might not have been to actually monitor truck drivers, Agent Chen explained to Harold during one of their interviews, but to make drivers believe they were being monitored. This type of psychological operation can be more effective than actual surveillance because it creates self-censorship and behavioral modification without requiring ongoing resources. This interpretation of Harold's experience was both reassuring and disturbing. If the surveillance equipment had never actually existed, then Harold's truck had not been compromised and his privacy had not been violated in the ways he had believed. However, the psychological manipulation he had experienced was real, and the operation's success in making him question his own perceptions and memories had been complete. Agent Chen's investigation ultimately concluded that the incidents reported by Harold and other drivers were likely the result of a sophisticated psychological operation designed to test and refine techniques for influencing driver behavior and decision-making. The operation's sponsors and ultimate purpose remained unknown, but the FBI's assessment was that it represented a form of research rather than active intelligence gathering. Harold found this conclusion difficult to accept. The radio transmissions he had heard had included detailed personal information that would have required extensive research and intelligence gathering to obtain. The vehicles that had intercepted him had demonstrated capabilities and coordination that suggested significant resources and organization. The psychological manipulation he had experienced had been precisely calibrated to his personality and circumstances. Something that sophisticated doesn't happen by accident, Harold told Agent Chen during their final interview. Someone invested serious time and money in developing the capabilities I experienced. Even if the ultimate goal was research rather than intelligence collection, the research itself represents a significant security concern. Agent Chen acknowledged Harold's concerns, but explained that the FBI's investigation had reached the limits of what could be determined without additional evidence or cooperation from the individuals responsible for the operation. The case remained open but inactive, pending new developments or similar incidents that might provide additional investigative leads. Harold's experience during the winter of 2021 permanently changed his approach to long-distance trucking. He installed additional communication equipment in his truck, including satellite phone capability and multiple radio systems that would make it more difficult for anyone to isolate him from outside contact. He also modified his routes and schedules to avoid predictable patterns that might make him vulnerable to surveillance or interception. Most importantly, Harold developed relationships with other drivers and researchers who were documenting similar incidents, creating an informal network of individuals who could provide mutual support and verification of unusual experiences. This network helped Harold maintain confidence in his own perceptions while providing early warning of new surveillance activities or psychological operations targeting truck drivers. Harold's story became a case study in Dr. Torres's research on transportation security, serving as an example of how sophisticated psychological operations could be conducted against critical infrastructure workers. The case highlighted vulnerabilities in the commercial transportation system that extended beyond traditional security concerns into the realm of psychological warfare and behavioral manipulation. As of 2024, Harold continues to work as a long-distance truck driver, but he remains vigilant for signs of surveillance or psychological manipulation. His experience has made him an advocate for transportation security measures that address not just physical threats, but also psychological and electronic warfare targeting commercial drivers. "What happened to me was real, regardless of what the FBI concluded," Harold reflects on his experience. "Someone demonstrated the ability to manipulate my perceptions, my emotions, and my decision-making in ways that could have gotten me killed or caused me to harm others. Whether that was done for research purposes or intelligence gathering doesn't change the fact that it represents a serious threat to transportation security." Harold's advocacy work has led to increased awareness among truck drivers about the potential for psychological operations and surveillance targeting their profession. His documented experience serves as a warning about vulnerabilities that most drivers never consider: the possibility that their radios, their trucks, and even their own minds might be compromised by sophisticated adversaries. The broader implications of Harold's experience extend beyond individual driver security into national transportation policy. If hostile entities can successfully manipulate truck driver behavior through psychological operations, they potentially possess the capability to disrupt supply chains, create transportation accidents, or gather intelligence about commercial cargo movements without the need for traditional espionage methods. Dr. Torres's research, building on Harold's case and similar incidents, has documented what appears to be a systematic program of psychological operations targeting commercial transportation throughout the northern United States. The program's sophistication and scope suggest resources and capabilities that exceed those of typical criminal organizations or commercial competitors. "We're dealing with something that represents a new category of threat to transportation security," Dr. Torres concluded in his preliminary report. Traditional security measures focus on protecting cargo and preventing accidents, but they don't address the possibility that drivers themselves might be targeted for psychological manipulation or behavioral control. The Department of Homeland Security has begun incorporating lessons learned from Harold's case into training programs for transportation security personnel. However, the classification of much of this training material reflects the government's concern that public discussion of psychological operations targeting infrastructure workers might compromise ongoing counterintelligence efforts or inspire copycat activities. Harold's experience has also influenced the design of new truck communication systems, with manufacturers beginning to incorporate anti-spoofing technologies and authentication protocols that would make it more difficult for unauthorized parties to inject false communications into CB radio networks or other driver communication channels. The Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance has developed new guidelines for drivers who suspect they are being subjected to surveillance or psychological manipulation, including protocols for reporting incidents and preserving evidence while maintaining operational security. These guidelines acknowledge that traditional law enforcement responses may not be adequate for dealing with sophisticated psychological operations targeting transportation workers. Harold's relationship with the trucking community has evolved as a result of his experience and advocacy work. While some drivers initially viewed his reports with skepticism, the accumulation of similar accounts from other credible drivers has created growing awareness that psychological operations targeting truckers represent a real and ongoing threat. The CB radio networks that connect truck drivers across the country now include regular discussions about communication security and psychological manipulation tactics. Drivers share information about unusual radio transmissions, suspicious vehicle encounters, and other indicators that they might be targets of surveillance or manipulation efforts. Harold has become a resource for drivers experiencing unusual incidents, providing guidance on documentation, reporting procedures, and psychological coping strategies. his ability to maintain his career while dealing with the aftermath of his experience has made him a model for other drivers facing similar challenges. The most important thing I learned is that you have to trust your own perceptions while also being willing to question them. Harold advises drivers who contact him about unusual experiences. What happened to me was designed to make me doubt my own judgment and become dependent on outside sources for information about my own situation. Maintaining mental independence is just as important as maintaining operational security. Harold's marriage to Linda has grown stronger through their shared experience of dealing with surveillance and harassment. The couple's ability to work together to maintain their security and privacy has created a bond that extends beyond their previous relationship dynamic. Going through something like this changes you, Linda observes. You realize how vulnerable you are and how much you depend on systems and institutions that you assume are protecting you. But you also discover strengths you didn't know you had, and learn to rely on yourself and your closest relationships in ways you never had to before. The psychological counseling that Harold received following his experience has become an ongoing part of his life, helping him process not just the trauma of surveillance and manipulation, but also the broader implications of living in a world where such operations are possible and perhaps routine. Harold's therapist, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, specializes in treating individuals who have been subjected to sophisticated psychological manipulation. Her work with Harold and other clients has contributed to developing treatment approaches for what she terms technological trauma, psychological injuries resulting from exposure to advanced surveillance and manipulation technologies. Traditional trauma therapy assumes that the threatening experience is in the past and that the individual can develop a sense of safety by understanding that the threat is no longer present, Dr. Martinez explains. But with technological trauma, the capabilities that created the original experience continue to exist and may even be advancing. Healing requires learning to function effectively despite ongoing uncertainty about personal security and privacy. Harold's participation in Dr. Martinez's research has helped develop therapeutic approaches that acknowledge the reality of advanced surveillance and manipulation capabilities while helping individuals maintain psychological resilience and operational effectiveness despite these threats. The research has also contributed to understanding how psychological operations targeting critical infrastructure workers might be designed and implemented, providing insights that could be valuable for developing countermeasures and defensive strategies. Harold's experience has become a case study taught in military and intelligence training programs, illustrating how psychological operations can be conducted against civilian targets and what indicators might suggest that such operations are underway. The case demonstrates both the potential effectiveness of such operations and the importance of maintaining human sources who can provide early warning of new threats. The ongoing mystery surrounding the true identity and purpose of Agent Richardson and his team continues to trouble Harold. Despite extensive investigation by multiple agencies, no evidence has been found to confirm or deny the existence of the surveillance equipment that was allegedly removed from Harold's truck. This uncertainty has become one of the most psychologically challenging aspects of Harold's experience. The inability to definitively determine what actually happened to him makes it difficult to know what precautions are appropriate or what level of ongoing vigilance is justified. Not knowing is worse than knowing something terrible, Harold explains. If I knew for certain that my truck had been compromised and that the equipment had been removed, I could move on with confidence. If I knew for certain that the whole thing was a psychological operation designed to make me think I was being monitored, I could deal with that too. But not knowing means I have to live with the possibility that either interpretation is correct, and that's exhausting. Harold's inability to definitively resolve the mystery of his experience reflects broader challenges that individuals face when dealing with sophisticated adversaries who deliberately create ambiguity and uncertainty. The psychological impact of such ambiguity can be as damaging as the impact of confirmed surveillance or manipulation. Dr. Torres's research has identified this ambiguity warfare as a key component of psychological operations targeting critical infrastructure workers. By creating uncertainty about whether surveillance is actually occurring, such operations can achieve many of the same effects as actual surveillance while requiring fewer resources and creating less evidence. The goal is not necessarily to monitor everything, Dr. Torres explains, but to make targets believe they might be monitored at any time. This creates self-censorship and behavioral modification without requiring the infrastructure and resources that comprehensive surveillance would demand. Harold's experience has made him acutely aware of how this psychological dynamic affects his daily life and work. Even routine decisions about routes, schedules, and communications are influenced by his uncertainty about whether he might be monitored or manipulated. The adaptation strategies that Harold has developed include maintaining multiple communication channels, varying his behavioral patterns, and creating verification procedures that would make it more difficult for unauthorized parties to manipulate his perceptions or decision-making. Harold has also developed relationships with other drivers and transportation security professionals who can provide independent verification of his observations and experiences. This network serves as both an early warning system for new threats and a reality check for potentially suspicious incidents. The community of drivers who have experienced similar incidents has grown into an informal mutual support organization that shares information about threats, countermeasures, and coping strategies. This community provides Harold with validation of his experience while also offering practical resources for maintaining security and psychological resilience. Harold's transformation from an isolated driver who rarely used his CB radio to a community advocate and security researcher represents one of the most positive outcomes of his disturbing experience. His ability to find meaning and purpose in his encounter with unknown adversaries has provided a model for other individuals facing similar challenges. The research and advocacy work that grew out of Harold's experience has contributed to increased awareness of psychological operations targeting transportation workers and has influenced the development of new security measures and training programs designed to protect critical infrastructure from non-traditional threats. However, Harold acknowledges that his experience has also created ongoing challenges that affect every aspect of his life. The hypervigilance and suspicion that helped him survive his encounter with psychological manipulation have become permanent features of his personality that sometimes interfere with normal social and professional relationships. You can't go through something like this without being changed by it, Harold reflects. The challenge is being changed in ways that make you more resilient and effective rather than just more paranoid and isolated. I think I've managed to find a balance, but it's something I have to work at every day. Harold's continued success as a long-distance truck driver demonstrates that individuals can maintain their careers and effectiveness even after experiencing sophisticated psychological operations. However, his experience also illustrates the resources and support systems required to achieve such resilience. The psychological counseling, community support, research participation, and advocacy work that have helped Harold process his experience require time, energy, and resources that may not be available to all drivers who encounter similar threats. This disparity in available support creates vulnerability that could be exploited by adversaries seeking to target transportation workers. Harold's story has become an important case study for understanding how psychological operations targeting critical infrastructure workers might be conducted and countered. However, the ongoing mysteries surrounding his experience also serve as a reminder that such operations may be more common and more sophisticated than current defensive measures can address. As Harold continues his trucking career, he remains vigilant for signs of new surveillance or manipulation efforts, while also working to help other drivers recognize and respond to similar threats. His experience serves as both a warning about the vulnerabilities that truck drivers face and an example of how individuals can maintain their effectiveness despite sophisticated psychological operations. The broader implications of Harold's experience extend into questions about privacy, security, and the vulnerability of critical infrastructure workers to psychological manipulation. His case demonstrates that threats to transportation security may extend beyond traditional physical and cybersecurity concerns into the realm of psychological warfare, targeting the individuals who operate the systems that keep America's economy moving. For Harold, the most important lesson from his experience is the need for truck drivers to maintain awareness that they may be targets of sophisticated adversaries while also preserving their ability to function effectively in their profession. This balance between vigilance and operational effectiveness requires ongoing effort and community support. The road is different now than it was before this happened to me, Harold concludes. I see threats and vulnerabilities that I never noticed before. But I also see strengths and resources in the driver community that I didn't appreciate. We're more connected and more capable of protecting each other than I used to think. Whatever happened to me that night, whether it was real surveillance equipment or sophisticated psychological manipulation, it taught me that truck drivers can't afford to be isolated and self-reliant in the way we used to be. The threats we face are too sophisticated and too coordinated for any individual driver to handle alone. Harold's experience on the night frequency continues to influence his life and work years after the incident occurred. The voices that called his name and recited his personal information over CB radio channels that only he could hear remain as vivid and disturbing as they were during that December night in 2021. Whether those voices represented actual surveillance, psychological manipulation, or something else entirely, they fundamentally changed Harold's understanding of the vulnerabilities that come with life on America's highways. His story serves as a reminder that the familiar roads and communication channels that truck drivers depend on may harbor threats that exist beyond current understanding or defensive capabilities. For the hundreds of thousands of men and women who make their living moving freight across America's highway system, Harold's experience represents both a warning and a source of hope. The warning is that they may be more vulnerable to surveillance and manipulation than they realize. The hope is that awareness, preparation, and community support can help them maintain their effectiveness and security even when faced with threats that challenge their understanding of reality itself. The night frequency that Harold encountered during his journey across Montana continues to broadcast somewhere in the electromagnetic spectrum that surrounds America's highways. Whether it carries the voices of surveillance operators, psychological manipulation specialists, or something else entirely, it serves as a reminder that the empty roads and dark skies that provide the backdrop for long-distance trucking may conceal watchers whose purposes remain unknown and whose capabilities exceed conventional understanding. Harold Peterson drives those roads still, listening to his CB radio with the knowledge that the voices that call drivers' names in the night are real, even if their true nature remains a mystery that may never be fully solved.